You were taught history in straight lines, dates, names, empires rising and falling. But buried beneath that neat timeline lies something stranger. A world of whispered inventions, vanishing civilizations, and ancient geniuses who outsmarted modernity using mud, bone, and fire. This isn't the history they put in textbooks. These are the secrets they left behind on purpose or by accident, and by the time we're done, you won't be sure if we've come as far as we think. Welcome to 99 unknown ancient history facts that will blow your mind. And yes, some of them really will. Before we dive headfirst into the weird, the forgotten, and the jaw-droppingly brilliant, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next round of historical rabbit holes. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's see just how far these mysteries travel. The Egyptians had pregnancy tests. Picture this: 1,800 BCE, somewhere in ancient Thebes. A woman, suspecting she might be pregnant, is handed a handful of barley and emmer wheat. Her midwife tells her to urinate on both. No gods involved, no incantations, just seeds and pee. If the barley sprouts first, it's a boy. If wheat, it's a girl. If neither, she's not pregnant. And yes, modern science tested this in the 20th century. Turns out there's some hormonal truth to it. Estrogen can speed up germination. Ancient Egypt, where magical thinking and empirical testing danced uneasily around each other like rival court jesters. This test wasn't hidden in tombs or locked behind priesthood secrets. It was part of ordinary, daily life. It suggests something we often overlook. Ancient people didn't always rely on gods for answers. Sometimes, they relied on observation, trial, and error, and the world's most bizarre scientific method: sprout watching. And here's the twist. What else did they know that we've long dismissed as myth, only to find scientific backing thousands of years later? This pregnancy test isn't just a fact, it's a crack in the mirror of modern arrogance. Because if they could figure out human biology with barley and wheat, what the hell else did they know? Romans used powdered mouse brains for toothpaste. To brush like a Roman elite, all you needed was a slave, a mortar, and a freshly dead rodent. Powder the brain, mix with crushed bones, maybe add some charcoal for flair, and smear it on your teeth with a rag. Voila, morning breath, ancient style. There's a lot to unpack here. Hygiene wasn't the issue. The Romans were obsessed with grooming. Public bathhouses were more popular than politics. But their dental hygiene walked a tightrope between innovation and horror. Mouse brains? Not exactly minty fresh, but abrasive, enzymatic, and disturbingly effective. Imagine the daily routine. Waking up, dressing in togas, and lathering your mouth with the cognitive remains of vermin. Makes your overpriced charcoal toothpaste seem pretty tame. But here's the question no one asks. Why mouse brains? Why not boar, cat, or even human? Was there something symbolic in using a creature associated with decay to ward off decay? Or was it just the cheapest source of brains in the empire? If the Romans thought this was normal, what else did they do that we'd call barbaric but they called brilliant? The Indus Valley cities had flushing toilets. We call them ancient, but their bathrooms were cleaner than most modern gas stations. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, cities that predate Rome by thousands of years, and yet many homes had their own toilets, porcelain-free but plumbed. Waste was flushed into covered drains that flowed through the city, out of sight, out of smell. We think of civilization as a straight line fire: wheel, Rome, Renaissance, smartphones. But the Indus flips that narrative. These cities weren't ruled by kings or priests with god complexes. There's no sign of palaces, no massive statues, just meticulous urban planning and, apparently, a collective agreement on not pooping in the streets. The level of engineering was surgical. Standardized bricks, graded drainage, manholes. All before most cultures even had cities, let alone sanitation codes. And then, it vanishes. The entire civilization. No mass graves, no signs of war, just silence. Like they flushed themselves out of history. So we're left with a haunting question. If a civilization could create sewage systems while others were still inventing the wheel, how did they disappear without leaving a single written word? And if their toilets were that advanced, what were their minds like? The Olmecs made colossal stoneheads with helmets. They stare across the centuries with eyes wide open, massive basalt heads, each weighing as much as an elephant, lips pursed in silent judgment, helmets pressed down like the warriors of a forgotten empire. The Olmecs, often dubbed the mother culture of Mesoamerica, left behind no Rosetta Stone, no crumbling scrolls to explain their choices. Just these heads, 17 of them, give or take, carved from volcanic rock, transported over impossible distances without the wheel, and posed like ancient security guards for a mystery we can't even phrase correctly. Were they rulers? Athletes? Gods? No one knows. Some scholars believe their portraits individualized, down to the facial features and stern expressions. But if so, where are their names? Where's the ego that usually screams from royal monuments? The helmets raise even more questions. Some have speculated they resemble modern football gear, ritual protection, battle attire, or something else entirely. We may never know, and that's the part that gnaws at modern sensibilities, the inability to classify, to reduce, to explain. It's not just the heads that are heavy, it's the silence around them, like they're waiting for us to understand something too old, too alien to decode. And just when you think it couldn't get more bizarre, in ancient China, emperors consumed mercury to become immortal. Emperor Qin Shi Huang wanted to live forever, so his alchemists gave him poison. Mercury, the shimmering liquid metal, the god stuff of thermometers and madness. Ancient Chinese texts brim with tales of emperors and nobles chasing eternal life through a kaleidoscope of exotic compound cinnabar, gold elixirs, ground pearls. But mercury reigned supreme. It was pure, metallic, mysterious. It didn't rot, didn't rust, so, naturally, they drank it. What followed wasn't immortality, but rather a slow, trembling descent into delusion, tremors, and eventually death. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, died not from war or rebellion, but from swallowing the chemical embodiment of irony. His tomb remains unopened, said to contain rivers of flowing mercury meant to simulate the heavens. Soil tests suggest it might be true. If so, his final resting place is a deadly monument to self-inflicted delusion, a mausoleum filled with the very thing that killed him. And here's the haunting thought. What if he isn't the only one? What if history is a graveyard of people who reached for godhood and overdosed on the metaphor? But not everyone reached for power with gold and poison. Some turned to iron like the Spartans. Spartans used iron rods as currency. Imagine trying to buy groceries with a crowbar. That's essentially what Spartan currency was. Long, clunky iron rods, deliberately awkward, intentionally worthless outside of their borders. While the rest of Greece flirted with silver coins and gold lust, Sparta leaned into minimalism so hard it weaponized inconvenience. Why? Because money, to the Spartans, was a corrupting force. Luxury was weakness. Wealth made men soft. So they made their currency theft-proof not through laws or guards, but through sheer impracticality. Try hiding a yard-long iron stick under your toga. Try bribing someone when your wallet is a spear rack. This wasn't just economic policy, it was social engineering. By making wealth annoying, they made greed socially unbearable. Spartan culture, with all its brutal training and communal living, treated excess like a plague. Iron rods were a symptom of a deeper philosophy. Make life hard enough, and maybe no one gets soft. But here's the question. Did it work? Did their iron economy preserve virtue or just force their vices underground? What do you lose when you strip away luxury? And more importantly, if their currency was made to be unstealable, what did they fear losing so badly? The oldest known prosthetic is an Egyptian wooden toe. Buried in the sands of Thebes, Egypt, archaeologists found a foot that rewrote the timeline of medical ingenuity, a mummy with a meticulously crafted wooden toe, bound in leather, fitted with precision. It wasn't just symbolic. This wasn't a charm or a token to please the gods. It was worn, used, designed for walking. A prosthetic toe 3,000 years old tells us something profound. Not just that ancient Egyptians cared about cosmetic appearance, but that they valued mobility, functionality, and human dignity. The woman it belonged to likely came from wealth, perhaps a priest's daughter, a noblewoman, someone whose status warranted a custom-built limb. But what's truly striking is the craftsmanship. It fits anatomically. It bends. This wasn't a one-off. The wear and repair marks suggest prolonged use. And it forces us to confront a difficult truth. Everything we credit to modern medicine, compassion, biomechanics, prosthetics, was already in motion long before our textbooks say it began. So, what else are we misstating? What other fragments of ancient human empathy lie in tombs and museums, misinterpreted as trinkets instead of technologies? And while the Egyptians were designing limbs, the Babylonians were charting angles that wouldn't show up again for another millennium. The Babylonians had trigonometry 1,500 years before the Greeks. When we think trigonometry, we think Greek letters and dusty textbooks, sine, cosine, tangent. But long before Pythagoras allegedly stared at a triangle and had an epiphany, the Babylonians were busy doing actual math. Clay tablets from 1800 BCE reveal that Babylonian scholars weren't just dabbling in angles, they had a fully functional trigonometric system. And here's the kicker. They didn't use the base 10 system we're familiar with. They used base 60. Which, frankly, makes more sense. In some ways. It's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Perfect for fractions, astronomy, and yes, measuring the stars. This wasn't abstract theory. They used this knowledge for architecture, surveying, and celestial tracking. They had cosine tables. They knew how to calculate right-angled triangles without ever knowing what the word triangle meant in Greek. It's like finding out your great-grandparents were doing calculus with an abacus while your math teacher still used chalk. And yet, it took until the 20th century for modern mathematicians to decode those clay tablets correctly. All that time, we thought the Greeks invented this stuff. Turns out, they might have just had better PR. Speaking of overlooked brilliance, wait, until you hear what Viking women could legally do. Viking women had divorce rights and property ownership. Before suffragettes marched and lawmakers debated the radical idea that women might be people too, Viking women were out there owning land, filing for divorce, and telling men exactly where to shove their longboats. In Norse societies, a woman could inherit property, run a farm, and divorce her husband simply by declaring it in front of witnesses. No groveling before judges, no shaming rituals, just words and presence. She could demand her dowry back, keep her livestock, and boot an abusive husband back to the fjords. This wasn't a utopia. Let's not romanticize axe-wielding patriarchy, but compared to what was happening in medieval Europe, Viking women were basically operating under a Scandinavian version of early civil rights. They weren't passive figures waiting to be rescued. They were shipwrights, merchants, sometimes even warriors. And sagas don't just mention them, they center them. Strong-willed, sharp-tongued, and legally empowered. So where did all that go? Why did later societies roll back these rights like they were refunding justice? The trail of forgotten freedoms is as ancient as civilization. And as we peer deeper into history's footnotes, we find that even in the Roman Empire, your laundry could reek of a deeper irony. The Romans used urine to bleach clothes. Yes, urine, gallons of it, collected in amphorae that lined the streets of Rome like a very unfortunate recycling program, and all of it was destined not for disposal but for fashion. Roman fullers, essentially the ancient world's dry cleaners, used ammonia-rich human urine to clean and bleach garments. It broke down grease, lifted stains, and brightened whites like a cursed version of OxyClean. Workers would stomp on clothes in vats of the yellow stuff, like winemakers at a bodily fluid-themed festival, churning fabrics in the acrid stew of urban sanitation. Even more surreal, the Roman government taxed it. Emperor Vespasian famously defended the urine tax by holding a coin to his nose and declaring, "Money does not stink," a joke that somehow made it into legislation. So the next time you imagine Rome as a marble wonderland of togas and oratory, remember the stink. The empire might have ruled the known world, but its whites were cleaned in pee. And what does it say about a civilization when its labor class spends their days ankle-deep in bodily waste so the elite can sparkle at dinner? At least the Hittites gave us something more lasting, the very birth of an age. The Hittites were the first to smelt iron. They weren't the biggest empire, or the flashiest, but the Hittites, nestled in ancient Anatolia, quietly lit a fire that would change the trajectory of human civilization. They figured out how to smelt iron. Bronze ruled before Theman, alloy of copper and tin, strong but expensive, fragile in war. Iron, by contrast, was abundant, durable, and maddeningly difficult to work with. The Hittites cracked the code. They developed the high-heat furnaces, the cooling techniques, the ritual knowledge to turn earth into weaponry. But here's where the mystery blooms. How did they do it, and why did their knowledge vanish? Their empire collapsed around 1200 BCE in the Bronze Age apocalypse, mysterious wave of destruction that took down several major civilizations. And with their fall, ironworking disappeared into the shadows for generations. It resurfaced, scattered, and altered, as if humanity had to relearn it all over again. The Hittites don't get the headlines, no epic poems, no great ruins to rival Rome, just the eerie legacy of having given birth to an age and then being swallowed by it. Still, not everything from their era eroded. In Egypt, a door was built so well, it refused to stop working. A 3,000-year-old Egyptian temple still had working doors. Imagine walking into a ruin and watching the door creak open, not because of some cinematic CGI magic, but because the hinges still function after 3,000 years. That's not myth. That's ancient Egyptian engineering. In the Temple of Karnak, archaeologists discovered doors that had, for millennia, maintained their functionality. Bronze pivots rotated in stone sockets, worn smooth by centuries of reverent motion. No ball bearings, no WD-40, just geometry, material mastery, and a culture obsessed with permanence. It wasn't just about entering a space. These were thresholds between realms, life and afterlife, mortal and divine. Temples weren't just buildings, they were machines for eternity. And every component was designed to last beyond dynasties, sandstorms, and time itself. The ancient Egyptians didn't build for convenience, they built for cosmic alignment. And somehow, that aligned them with structural principles modern architects are still rediscovering. So, the next time your closet door squeaks after 2 years, remember, someone in 1250 BCE figured out how to build a hinge that outlived entire empires. And if they could do that with stone and bronze, what else were ancient people doing with bone? Because in Peru, they weren't just cracking skulls, they were saving lives. Ancient Peruvians performed successful skull surgeries. You're lying on a stone slab in the highlands of ancient Peru. No anesthesia, no stainless steel, just obsidian blades, sacred herbs, and a man in ceremonial garb preparing to cut a hole in your skull. Not to kill you, to save you. Trepanation drilling into the cranium sounds like something from a horror story, yet the Moche and Inca cultures practiced it with such precision that patients often survived. How do we know? The bone regrew. Smooth edges, healing signs. Archaeologists have found hundreds of trepan skulls across Peru, some with multiple Holis evidence that people survived and came back for more. Why? It wasn't just superstition. These weren't mere ritual sacrifices. Many trepanations were likely done to treat head trauma, relieve pressure, or even address mental illness. Their survival rates? Up to 70%, which is more than some 19th century European surgeons could claim. There were no hospitals, no sterile gloves, and yet they figured out not only how to open a skull, but how not to kill someone in the process. If this was the state of medicine in pre-Columbian Peru, then perhaps everything we assume about primitive cultures needs surgery of its own. And while they opened skulls, the Sumerians were busy inventing something even more foundational civilization itself. The Sumerians invented the concept of a city. The wheel? Cute. Writing? Essential. But the city, that's the real game changer, and it started with the Sumerians. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. These weren't just settlements, they were orchestrated ecosystems, grids of homes, temples, administrative hubs, and sewage systems. Yes, sewage. The Sumerians had more sanitation than some modern towns. They didn't stumble into cities, they designed them. With zoning, with irrigation canals, with social layers literally baked into their mud brick architecture. This wasn't a fluke of geography. It was a conscious shift from tribe to polity, from wandering to nesting. It meant surplus. It meant taxes. It meant priests, scribes, and bureaucrats all sharing space with farmers, laborers, and the occasional invading army. The city changed human psychology. It required cooperation with strangers, trust in rules, and paranoia about your neighbor's expanding goat collection. Sumer wasn't just the origin of civilization, it was the origin of urban tension. And if you think their city planning was impressive, wait until you realize their descendants figured out how to build something even stronger than politics or priesthoods. Concrete that never dies. Roman concrete gets stronger with time. Modern concrete cracks. Roman concrete heals. It's one of those ancient engineering marvels that makes you want to slap your local construction contractor. Roman harbors, aqueducts, and buildings still stand not in ruins, but intact, because the Romans knew something we forgot: how to make concrete that improves with age. The secret? Volcanic ash. When mixed with lime and seawater, it triggers a rare chemical reaction. Instead of corroding, it grows crystals form inside cracks, sealing them tighter than before. It's like giving stone a circulatory system. And it means structures built 2,000 years ago are still solid in ways our 50-year bridges envy. This wasn't just technological, it was philosophical. The Romans didn't build for a generation. They built for empire, for gods, for legacy. They embedded resilience into stone because their worldview demanded it. We talk about modern progress, but maybe we're regressing with nicer glass. Maybe the Romans weren't just building cities, they were building time-resistant ideas. And while they were engineering immortality from rock, surgeons in India were literally reshaping the human face centuries before we figured out how to bill for it. In ancient India, plastic surgery was practiced. Long before the word plastic meant synthetic, and centuries before rhinoplasty became a red carpet, cliché ancient Indian physicians were reconstructing noses with surgical finesse that still baffles modern medicine. Around 600 BCE, a surgeon named Sushruta compiled a medical text so advanced, it reads like a rogue chapter from a modern surgical manual. The Sushruta Samhita detailed procedures for cataract removal, dental surgery, and most notably, reconstructive nasal surgery. The technique? cutting a flap of skin from the cheek or forehead and grafting it to the nasal cavity. Clean, calculated, and astonishingly effective. Why so many nose jobs? Because mutilation of the nose was a common punishment for adultery or crime, which means, tragically, the demand for facial reconstruction was high. But it also means that ancient Indian doctors weren't just healers, they were restorers of dignity in a culture that literally disfigured people into shame. These weren't mystical hacks. They were medical professionals with sterilization tools, sutures, and an understanding of anatomy that shouldn't have existed, but it did. And if surgery seems advanced, wait until you see what they painted on their pottery, because in ancient Peru, art wasn't decoration, it was documentation. The Moche civilization depicted medical scenes on pottery. Most ancient pottery features gods, animals, or heroic epics. The Moche, they gave us childbirth, amputations, tumors, and even enemas. Welcome to the Gallery of Realism, Peruvian edition. These ceramic vessels, finely shaped, vividly painted, and eerily lifelike, weren't just for water or grain. They were records. The Moche civilization, which thrived on the northern coast of Peru from 100 to 700 CE, crafted pottery that chronicled the physical and psychological reality of their lives. That includes surgeries mid-procedure, people giving birth, dental work, and even sexual practices portrayed in startling anatomical accuracy. It's not just the content that's radical, it's the intent. The Moche used pottery as visual case studies, passing down knowledge not through scrolls or writing, but through ceramic storytelling. If these pots could speak, they'd explain things medical textbooks forgot. What's even more remarkable is how human it all feels. A woman grimacing in labor, a healer poised over a wound. These weren't idealized images. They were raw, domestic, and terrifyingly familiar. The Moche didn't just depict life, they preserved the full, unfiltered mess of it. Which makes you wonder what else we've cleaned up from history that was never meant to be sterile. And if realism bothers you, don't look at Greek statues because they weren't white. They were loud. Greek statues were originally painted in bright colors. The clean, white marble statues that fill our museums? Lies. Sanitized lies, polished by Renaissance idealism and centuries of cultural bleaching literally. The Greeks, it turns out, loved color. Not subtle pastels either. We're talking bold blues, bloody reds, glossy blacks, and metallic gold slathered onto their stone gods like someone let a rock star loose with a paintbrush. Statues of Athena, Apollo, and Dionysus once blazed with vibrancy, their robes shimmering and their eyes practically glowing. But centuries of sun, rain, and restoration efforts stripped away the color, leaving us with the ghostly aesthetic we now associate with classical beauty, an aesthetic that's deeply misleading. The myth of white purity isn't just an art historical oversight, it's a philosophical one. The Renaissance looked at those blank statues and projected ideals of restraint, logic, and racialized perfection. But in reality, the Greeks were theatrical, garish, and far more chaotic than we let them be. So the next time someone invokes classical beauty, remember, you're probably looking at a naked statue that was once dressed in highlighter hues and eyeliner. Which makes sense when you consider who their teachers were, because the Etruscans, for all their mystery, taught Rome how to build its arches, and then vanished behind them. The Etruscans taught the Romans how to build arches. Rome. In all its grandeur, those towering aqueducts, colosseums, triumphal gateways, its architectural backbone to a people we barely remember, the Etruscans. They were there before Rome, nestled in the hills of central Italy, crafting vaulted tombs and curved stone structures with an engineering grace the Romans would later claim as their own. The arch, Etruscan. The use of keystones and voussoirs? Etruscan. The entire Roman concept of transferring weight through a curve to allow taller, stronger structures. You guessed it. And yet, their language remains undeciphered, their texts lost. What survives is architecture and questions. The Romans learned from them, absorbed them, then buried them under the weight of their own legend. Even the word Etruscan is what others called them. To themselves, they were the Ravenna. But no one today speaks that name in the streets they helped design. It's the historical equivalent of erasing the engineer but keeping the blueprint, which leaves us wondering how much of history is built atop forgotten genius, and how many of our wonders are plagiarized from ghosts. At least one ancient group didn't just build for the living, they built cold chambers in the desert. Meet the Nabataeans. The Nabataeans created desert refrigeration systems. In the middle of the Jordanian desert, where the sun bleaches bone and rock alike, the Nabataeans made it snow metaphorically. This mysterious Arab people, best known for carving Petra into rose-red cliffs, were also brilliant hydrologists and thermal engineers. Using an elaborate system of cisterns, water tunnels, and evaporative cooling, they devised ways to refrigerate food, wine, and even homes in a landscape where nature offered no such luxury. These weren't just water collectors, they were environmental hackers. They placed water channels underground, shaded them with stone, and used wind and evaporation to lower temperatures dramatically. By manipulating airflow and humidity, they could create microclimates cold enough to preserve perishables. This wasn't just convenience, it was survival. And it meant they could trade, store, and thrive in conditions that killed lesser settlements. Petra wasn't simply a city, it was a thermodynamic puzzle box, an oasis carved not just from rock, but from pure ingenuity. And yet, as Rome fell and new religions swept the sands, the Nabataeans disappeared, leaving their cool chambers to bake in the sun. They were scientists without textbooks, much like their Mesopotamian cousins, who weren't just irrigating fields, they were brewing beer in divine abundance. Ancient Mesopotamians brewed over 20 kinds of beer. Long before Oktoberfest and IPA snobbery, the ancient Sumerians were getting pleasantly drunk in the Fertile Crescent. Beer wasn't just a beverage in Mesopotamia, it was the drink of civilization. Over 20 varieties flowed from their clay jugs, each with its own name, purpose, and probably reputation. Some were thick and porridge-like, others were filtered, spiced, even reserved for rituals. Beer was so essential, it had its own goddess, Ninkasi, whose hymn also doubled as a recipe. Everyone drank it. Workers were paid in beer, priests offered it to the gods, and kings used it to solidify alliances. Clean water was unreliable. Beer was fermented safety. Their cuneiform tablets show detailed accounts of barley distribution, brewing procedures, and consumption records that read suspiciously like party logs. The ancient pub crawl? Probably a royal procession with amphorae. But beneath the buzz is something deeper, the understanding that fermentation is power. To turn grain into sustenance and celebration is an alchemy, both chemical and cultural. And if your currency is beer, then what happens when your money grows from soil? You'd be surprised what the Japanese used instead of coins. In ancient Japan, rice was used as currency. Before coins clinked and paper crinkled, Japan measured wealth by the grain literally. Rice wasn't just food, it was value. Land was judged by how much rice it could yield. People were taxed in bushels, and salaries came in sacks. A lord's power wasn't gauged by armies or acreage alone, but by how many koku of rice he controlled, a single koku being enough to feed one man for a year, which means rice was more than sustenance, it was status, survival, sovereignty. This wasn't symbolic. Samurai were often paid in rice. The government stockpiled it in granaries that were more like fortified banks. And with the right paperwork, you could use your rice credit as a medium of exchange of proto-paper currency, backed by actual food, not abstract trust. But rice, as currency, had a dark side. Famines didn't just starve people, they bankrupted them. Corruption festered where rice was hoarded, and riots sparked when prices inflated beyond reason. Wealth that could rot was wealth that could rebel. The economy was edible and volatile, and eerily poetic. What you eat is what you're worth. But while Japan built economies on grain, Greek philosophers were busy warning humanity about something far more insidious: reading. Greek philosophers warned against reading too much. In a culture that gave birth to literature, tragedy, and epic poems, it's almost comical that some of Greece's brightest minds feared of books. Socrates, for one, distrusted the written word. He believed that writing would erode memory, corrupt wisdom, and give the illusion of knowledge without understanding. He never wrote anything down, not out of laziness, but principle. He feared a future where people quoted texts instead of thinking. His student Plato ironically did right, but even he echoed the warning. Reading creates forgetfulness in the soul. Once ideas are externalized, they become static. Conversation, in contrast, was alive. Truth, to them, was not stored, it was performed. What they feared was the separation of thought from thinker. Reading, in excess, could lead to parroting instead of pondering. Information without transformation. And here's the punchline. They weren't entirely wrong. We've all seen the meme, quote, internet scholar, the book collector who never reads, the graduate who forgets what they studied. The philosophers of Athens might have feared TikTok. Still, writing prevailed. It preserved their doubts as much as their insights. And while Greece debated literacy, Babylon carved a worldview literally into stone. A Babylonian map of the world from 600 BCE Street Ill exists. Picture the oldest world map, and you're probably imagining crude squiggles or mythological beasts. But the Babylonian version is far stranger and more honest. Etched into clay around 600 BCE, this map shows the known world as a flat disk surrounded by a great cosmic ocean. The central landmass includes Babylon itself, surprise, encircled by other cities and exotic, vaguely threatening regions, places where monstrous beasts and strange peoples dwell. Beyond that, the bitter river, a metaphorical moat that separates humanity from the unknown. It wasn't just geography, it was theology, cosmology, imperial branding. The map reflected Babylon's centrality in both the spiritual and material world. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was the city. Everything else radiated from it, like ripples from a divine stone thrown into space-time. But what's eerie is how familiar it feels. The center of the map is always us. The outer rim is always chaos. We've redrawn the borders and renamed the monsters, but the worldview hasn't changed much. So the map endures not as a record of terrain, but of belief. And just beyond the map's edge, in the forests of Europe, soap bubbles were already forming, centuries before the Romans figured out hygiene. The Celts used soap long before the Romans. When you think of Celts, you probably imagine wild-haired warriors with painted faces, not a people obsessively scrubbing themselves with homemade soap. But that's the paradox. These so-called barbarians were cleaning up long before the self-proclaimed civilized Romans figured out how not to smell like a battlefield. Celtic tribes made soap from animal fat and plant ash, combining practicality with surprising chemical awareness. The resulting concoction wasn't just used for hygiene, it was also employed in textile dyeing. Lather up, rinse out the dirt, and prep your wool for the next burst of color. Multifunctional, efficient, and no overpriced branding needed. Roman historians later mocked them as primitive, conveniently omitting the fact that Celtic soap predated Roman baths by centuries. It's a recurring theme in ancient history. The conqueror rebrands the conquered as uncivilized, even while stealing their tools. So the next time you see a luxury artisanal soap bar wrapped in twine and folklore, remember some Celtic grandmother already did that. In a hut, with lye. And if you think that's quirky, wait until you hear what the Aztecs were stuffing in their wallets. Hint, it wasn't gold, it was beans. The Aztecs used cacao beans as money. Chocolate wasn't always a dessert. Once, it was currency. In the bustling markets of the Aztec Empire, you could buy a tamale with a handful of cacao beans. Need a prostitute? 10 beans. A turkey? About 100. These bitter little seeds were more than ingredients. They were a functioning, government-recognized medium of exchange. This wasn't just bartering. The Aztecs had an entire economy running on the fragile backs of future hot chocolate. Tribute was paid in cacao. Tribute records meticulously kept listed exact bean counts. The beans were portable, divisible, and had inherent value, drinkable wealth. Of course, this kind of currency came with its own inflation problems. Fake beans counterfeit cacao made from clay or painted wood started circulating. You know your economy's mature when the fraud shows up. The irony? The elites rarely drank the stuff. Cacao was sacred, often reserved for rituals and priests. The poor spent it. The powerful sipped it ceremonially, often spiced with chili or blood. No marshmallows. In a way, money never tasted sweeter or darker. And while the Aztecs were counting beans, Egyptian workers were about to do something far more revolutionary: tell their bosses to shove it. Ancient Egyptian workers went on strike. Think the labor strike is a modern invention? Try 3,000 years ago, in the land of pyramids and divine kings, when a group of overworked tomb builders under Pharaoh Ramses III decided enough was enough. They weren't slaves. These were skilled artisans working in Deir el-Medina, tasked with constructing the eternal homes of the pharaohs. But when their wages paid in grain and beer were delayed, they staged a walkout. They laid down their tools, marched to the local temple, and refused to work. It was peaceful, organized, and absolutely unprecedented. They even presented a written complaint. "We are hungry." That's not metaphor, it's ancient labor litigation. And here's the kicker. They won. The authorities caved. Supplies were delivered. Work resumed. This wasn't a revolution, it was a negotiation. But it cracked the illusion of divine labor order. Even in a kingdom where the pharaoh was a living god, hungry workers could say no. The story didn't end there. Egypt's economy continued to falter, and labor unrest became more common. Maybe they weren't building pyramids anymore, but they were building something else, the foundation of workers' rights. And just as they pushed back against oppression, the Chinese were building a dragon-powered disaster alert system. Chinese seismographs detected earthquakes with dragons. In the 2nd century CE, the Chinese weren't just watching the earth, they were listening to its shivers. Enter Zhang Heng, a polymath who constructed what might be the most poetic machine in ancient science, a dragon-powered earthquake detector. Picture a bronze urn, round and imposing, with 8 ornate dragon heads spaced evenly around its circumference. Beneath each dragon's mouth, a bronze toad sat patiently, waiting. When the earth trembled imperceptibly to humans, but not to this deviceia, mechanism inside triggered the dragon in the direction of the quake to release a ball into the mouth of its corresponding toad. The sound of the drop signaled both the occurrence and the direction of the earthquake. This wasn't mysticism. It was early geophysics, centuries before Europe would even begin to dream of such precision. The fact that the device could detect distant quake 7.1s that left no local damage meant ancient China wasn't just reacting to nature's fury. It was trying to predict and understand it. It's easy to laugh at dragons and toads. But ask yourself, how many modern inventions can detect invisible forces and look like a steampunk oracle? Meanwhile, over in the Mediterranean, ancient plumbing was less mystical, but just as revolutionary. Minoans had indoor plumbing and hot water. Long before Europe clawed its way out of the Dark Ages, the Minoans were living like gods on the island of Crete with hot showers, flushing toilets, and multi-story homes connected by a network of underground pipes. Palace complexes like Knossos weren't just labyrinthine in legend, They were marvels of engineering. They boasted terracotta sewage systems, sophisticated drainage, and even vertical shafts for ventilation. Rainwater was harvested, gray water was removed, and some rooms had tubs that wouldn't look out of place in a modern Airbnb, assuming you like your bathtubs, with a side of bull worship. Hot water? Supplied by cleverly designed clay pipes heated by the sun. No electricity, no gas. Just smart physics and a culture that seemed to believe humans deserved to live comfortably, cleanly, and without marinating in their own filth. While future medieval lords were defecating out of castle windows, Minoan nobles were reclining in tiled bathrooms. It wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about status, luxury, and maybe even spirituality. Civilization didn't evolve in a straight line. Sometimes it spiraled down into darkness and back into light. And speaking of time spirals before there were sundials, the Greeks read the shadows directly from the earth. Greeks used shadow clocks before sundials. Before the elegance of carved marble sundials, ancient Greeks used something more primal and more revealing: shadow clocks. Stick a gnomon, a vertical rod, into the ground, and watch the sun's shadow crawl across pre-measured markers like a celestial finger ticking off time. These early shadow clocks were both simple and profound. No moving parts, no gears, just cosmic geometry translated into daily rhythm. Time was measured not by machines, but by movements across sky, shadow across earth. It was philosophy in action, the divine order made legible. These devices weren't just about timekeeping. They were used for rituals, agriculture, and celestial observations. Temples were aligned with solstices, feasts scheduled by solar motion. Reality itself became predictable not through superstition, but observation. And yet this raw connection to the sky carried a certain tension. To know the time was also to know mortality. Shadows lengthened as days shortened. Time, literally, slipped away at your feet. Which makes it all the more haunting that, while the Greeks measured life in shadows, some cultures shaped it, starting with the bones of the head itself. The Huns wrapped babies' heads to shape their skulls. To the Huns, a flat forehead was a birth defect, and a round skull was an insult. So they did what any warrior culture obsessed with visual dominance might do: they started shaping their children's skulls like war trophies. From infancy, Hun babies had their heads tightly bound with cloth or wooden boards. The goal? Elongation. Not for medicine, not for injury, but for status. A stretched skull was noble, fearsome. It marked you as elite, and in battle, it made the Huns look otherworldly, shadowy silhouettes with foreheads sloping into eternity. This wasn't exclusive to the Huns. Many cultures practiced cranial deformation: Maya, Parakas, Scythians, but the Huns perfected it as identity branding. Imagine weaponizing your child's silhouette to psychologically dismantle enemies before the first arrow flew. It wasn't painful, at least. Not by historical accounts. It was normalized and irreversible. Your identity was formed not by your words but by your skull. In the modern world, we reshape teeth with braces and jaws with surgery. The Huns did the same with linen and time. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, another empire was communicating across vast mountain ranges without a single word written. Inca messengers ran across the Andes without writing. No roads, no writing, no wheels. And yet, the Inca Empire, stretching over 2,500 miles of brutal terrain, ran like clockwork. Why? Because of men who ran. Literally. These were the chasqui, relay runners trained from youth to sprint between mountain stations along the Hapaknyan, the ancient road system. They passed messages not on paper, but in memory and knots. Yes, knots. The quipu, a bundle of colored cords with specific knots, was the Inca's data storage device. Different knots signified numbers, dates, goods, or even possibly syllables. The Chasqui memorized the meanings and relayed updates faster than any empire had a right to expect. A message could travel hundreds of miles in a day. This wasn't just communication. It was logistics, census, taxation, military dispatches all knotted into rope and carried across clouds. They built a civilization without a written alphabet, yet with a system sophisticated enough to rival any bureaucratic state. And they did it on foot. No horses, no wheels. Just lungs, legs, and memory. While the Inca ran their empire in silence, another ancient culture was stoking something louder, hotter, and centuries ahead of its time. Steel. Ancient Africans smelted steel, using advanced furnaces. Long before Europe stumbled into the Iron Age, African metallurgists were already pulling something stronger from the earth steel. Not just iron, not just bronze, but high-quality, carbon-infused steel in sub-Saharan Africa over 2,000 years ago. The Nok culture of what is now Nigeria, along with others like the Haya of Tanzania, used preheated furnaces with airflow systems so sophisticated that some modern engineers couldn't replicate them without blowing a circuit. These weren't crude fire pits, they were thermodynamic marvels. They reached temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Celsius shot, enough to reduce iron ore and manipulate its carbon content. Which means they weren't just discovering metal, they were designing materials. This wasn't accidental. These furnaces had engineered bellows, chimneys, and airflow dynamics. Knowledge passed through oral tradition, refined through repetition, and preserved in dirt. But of course, you rarely hear about this. African technological brilliance has long been buried under colonial assumptions and academic inertia. The narrative prefers pyramids or jungle huts, nothing in between. Yet, here stands the evidence. Not just forged steel, but forged histories. And while African metallurgists were shaping strength from fire, the Romans were beginning to see the world through a new lens glass. Romans used glass windows in wealthy homes. Glass, transparent, fragile, light-catching, common now. But in ancient Rome, it was the architectural equivalent of magic. Not because it was decorative, but because it allowed the rich to do something no one else could: see the outside world while staying warm. Glass windows weren't widespread. They were a luxury reserved for the elite, thick, imperfect, and blurry by modern standards, but functional. Melted sand and soda ash poured into sheets or blown into crude panes, then set into wooden or metal frames. These weren't meant for perfect views. They were about light, insulation, and a clear distinction between those who could afford privacy and weatherproofing and those who couldn't. Most Romans lived in insulate-crowded, windowless apartment blocks, where ventilation came with the aroma of the street. But the wealthy? They had private baths, heated floors, and rooms where the sun streamed through warped glass like the gods themselves had filtered the sky. It's not just a story of technology. It's a story of class, of optics, literal and metaphorical. The ability to see without being seen. To observe the world through a barrier only money could buy. And speaking of barriers, Pythagoras drew one around your dinner plate and banned the most harmless of foods. Pythagoras banned beans. Of all the strange taboos ancient philosophers imposed, this one wins the prize for weirdest dietary restriction. Pythagoras, the triangle guy, the father of right angles and irrational numbers, vehemently opposed eating beans. Not for health reasons, not for taste, for metaphysics. To him, beans were portals to the underworld. Their hollow stems were believed to be passageways for souls. Eating them, he thought, invited death. Or worse, reincarnation in reverse. One ancient tale even claims he let himself be killed by soldiers rather than run through a field of beans, death before legumes. His followers, the Pythagoreans, adopted the same bizarre principle: no meat, no beans, lots of math. Modern speculation ties the ban to possible digestive issues, perhaps a hereditary condition like favism, but that's retroactive rationalization. The truth is simpler and more telling. Pythagoras viewed the world as a spiritual equation. Everything had meaning, especially what you ate. And beans? Too chaotic. So the next time you hear someone praise plant-based diets, remember that one of history's greatest minds died with a stomach full of ideology and not a single lentil in sight. Meanwhile, across the Nile, Egyptian priests weren't worried about beans. They were too busy shaving every hair from their bodies for the gods. Ancient Egyptian priests shaved all body hair. In the land of gods with animal heads and celestial boats, holiness wasn't just about piety, it was about cleanliness. And for ancient Egyptian priests, that meant taking a razor to every follicle on their bodies. Head to toe, eyebrows included. This wasn't a fashion choice, it was sacred hygiene. Hair was considered impure, a possible harbor for disease or demonic spirits. Before entering a temple, a priest would cleanse not just his soul, but his skin scrubbing, oiling, and shaving until his body was as smooth as the sacred statues he served. They did this daily, ritualistically, in silence. Their smooth skin wasn't vanity, it was devotion carved into flesh. The gods demanded purity, and priests became living symbols of that demand. In a culture obsessed with order, ma'at made sense. Cleanliness wasn't cosmetic, it was cosmic. To serve the divine, you had to strip away not just ego or desire, but even the fuzz of biology. And while Egyptian priests sought divine proximity through the blade, across the Irish Sea, another group sought power by keeping heads literally. Ancient Irish tribes practiced headhunting. In the mist-soaked hills and shadowed forests of Iron Age Ireland, warriors didn't just kill their enemies, they collected them. More specifically, they collected their heads. To the ancient Celts, the head was more than just a trophy. It was the seat of the soul, the container of identity, and a conduit of power. Taking an enemy's head wasn't just about victory, was about spiritual theft. Capture the skull, and you captured something eternal. Enemies became relics, friends became reminders, and homes were sometimes adorned with skulls not for horror, but for honor. Some accounts suggest that warriors displayed the heads of slain foes on spikes outside their homes. Others kept them inside as part of sacred rituals, conversations with the dead, or warnings to the living. The line between war crime and holy act blurred completely. What reads today like savagery was, for them, deeply religious. The head was sacred, revered, and owning one meant dominion not just over the body but over fate itself. And while the Irish preserved souls through skulls, another ancient culture was carving out harmony from bone in a different way through the oldest known instrument. The oldest known musical instrument is over 40,000 years old. Long before history, before writing, before cities, there was music. In a cave in what is now Germany, archaeologists uncovered a flute carved from a vulture's wing bone, perforated with precise holes, smoothed by hands that lived 40,000 years ago. Let that sink in. Our distant ancestors, who hunted mammoths and painted on limestone, were also crafting instruments and, presumably, sitting around fires making sound for beauty's sake. The bone flute is more than an artifact. It's a direct line to human emotion. This wasn't for survival. It wasn't for food or fire. It was for something intangible: melody, rhythm, perhaps even grief or celebration. The scale it plays is pentatonic, something still used today in lullabies and folk songs, which means the music of our ancestors wouldn't sound alien. It would sound hauntingly familiar. Music wasn't a late addition to humanity. It was there from the beginning, shaping identity, social cohesion, and maybe even early belief systems. Before the gods had names, we had notes. And speaking of ritual smoke and fire, another ancient tribe was inhaling the divine this time, through hemp-filled tents. The Scythians used cannabis in funeral rituals. Forget Woodstock. The Scythians were hotboxing long before it was cool and they did it for the dead. These nomadic warriors roamed the Eurasian steppes, feared for their cavalry and famed for their burial rites. According to Herodotus, when a Scythian chieftain died, his tribe would honor him by building a tent, throwing cannabis on hot stones, and sitting inside to inhale the smoke, not for pleasure but for spiritual communion. This wasn't recreational. It was sacred. The Scythians believed the smoke connected them to the afterlife, to ancestors, to realms beyond the veil. The effects? Likely mind-altering. Visions. Emotions. Maybe revelations. Maybe just coughing. What's remarkable is the archaeological backup. Excavations in burial mounds, or kurgans, have revealed traces of cannabis, scorched stones, and elaborate golden paraphernalia that suggest ritual use was more than myth. This wasn't about getting high. It was about getting closer to the dead, to the gods, to meaning itself. The air inside those tents must have been thick with grief, reverence, and the smoke of eternity. And far to the east, in tombs shaped like cosmic geometry, another people were arranging their final resting places under the symbols of the sky. Ancient Koreans built tombs in pyramidal shapes. While Egypt's pyramids bask in fame and shadow, the Korean peninsula quietly holds its own array of stone-faced enigmas. The ancient kingdoms of Korea, particularly Goguryeo and Silla-constructed burial mounds that echoed the geometric solemnity of their more famous cousins, pyramid-shaped tombs, aligned with celestial motifs and layered with symbolic intent. These tombs weren't massive like Giza's monuments, but they were cosmically precise. Many incorporated solar and lunar patterns, aligning entrances and chambers with the movements of the heavens. Stones were laid in tiers, with chambers beneath housing kings, queens, warriors, and their worldly treasures. These weren't just tombs, they were launch pads for the soul's voyage beyond. Inside, murals covered wall scenes of myth, constellations, animals guarding the afterlife, and heavenly dragons spiraling through the sky. It was architecture built as theology, geometry as resurrection, a blueprint for eternity. And yet, despite their grandeur, many remain sealed. Korean scholars have hesitated to open them, respecting ancient taboos and fearing damage to priceless relics. While some civilizations sought eternity in height, others mastered endurance underwater, because when the Romans weren't building roads, they were pouring the sea into stone. Romans used concrete to build underwater harbors. The sea doesn't like permanence. Salt corrodes, waves erode, water devours what man builds. But somehow, Roman harbors have endured not in ruins, but in eerie, barnacle-covered defiance. Their secret? Concrete. Not the kind we use today, but something older, and, absurdly, better. Roman marine concrete was made with volcanic ash, lime, and seawater. When mixed, it didn't just resist salt, it thrived in it. The chemical reaction between the seawater and volcanic ash created a rare mineral called aluminous tobermorite. The longer it sat, the stronger it grew. Which means Roman seawalls and harbor piers didn't decay, they matured. This wasn't a happy accident. The Romans knew what they were doing. They chose the materials. They tested mixtures. They recorded formulas in texts that remained obscure until scientists in our era finally figured out what they'd stumbled upon. And even now, we're still trying to reverse engineer their maritime magic. These weren't just docks. They were economic lifelines, naval fortresses, symbols of dominance cast into hostile waters. And they're still there. But while Rome's engineers poured ash into the sea, far across the ocean, children's tears were being harvested like rainwater, literally. Aztecs believed tears of children could summon rain. If the gods were angry, the skies stayed dry. And to appease them, the Aztecs turned to the most heartbreaking currency imaginable: the tears of children. Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility, was a demanding deity. His temples were filled with imagery of water, storms, and sacrifice. But not just any sacrifice. Children were offered to him, their cries believed to carry divine weight. The more they wept, the more likely rain would fall. Rituals were often timed with the agricultural calendar. If drought loomed or crops faltered, the priests would select young victims. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were real and devastating. Children were dressed in ceremonial clothes, sometimes paraded through the streets. Their tears, encouraged, even induced, became sacred signs that Tlaloc was listening. To the Aztecs, this wasn't cruelty, it was cosmology. The survival of the many demanded pain from the few, and to ensure the earth's thirst was quenched, innocence had to be poured out in its place. It's a moral equation that haunts any reflection on sacrificial logic. And if that sounds like overkill, wait until you see what the Khmer Empire did with water, not to worship it, but to weaponize it. The Khmer Empire engineered vast water reservoirs. Angkor Wat isn't just a temple, it's the tip of an iceberg floating in mud and genius. The Khmer Empire, which dominated Southeast Asia from the 9th to the 15th century, didn't just build sacred towers and celestial corridors. They built water. They engineered it, trapped it, weaponized it. Across hundreds of square kilometers, they constructed vast reservoirs, barrages, canals, and Moche hydrological infrastructure, so vast and interconnected, it makes modern plumbing look like kindergarten spaghetti. These weren't decorative ponds, they were precision tools. The reservoirs stored monsoon rains, redistributed water in dry seasons, prevented floods, and irrigated rice fields in mathematical harmony. Some barrages were larger than Manhattan's Central Park and dug entirely by human hands. Angkor wasn't just a city, it was a living water machine, a civilization balanced precariously on fluid dynamics, until, of course, the balance tipped. Environmental collapse, deforestation, and shifting climate patterns likely threw the system into chaos. When the water stopped obeying, the empire collapsed silently, slowly, beneath the weight of its own brilliance. But while the Khmers shaped the land, another ancient group mastered the sea without compasses or clocks, just stars, waves, and whispers of birds. Ancient Polynesians navigated thousands of miles without compasses. In an age before GPS, radar, or even maps, the ancient Polynesians found their way across the largest, emptiest ocean on Earth, with nothing but their senses, their memory, and the sky. From Hawaii to Easter Island to New Zealand, they crossed thousands of miles of open water in double-hulled canoes carved from sacred wood. No steel, no sails stitched with precision instruments. Just human intuition turned into science. They read the stars, but also the swells, the way waves refracted around distant islands, the flight paths of seabirds at dusk, the color of the water, the smell of the wind. Memory palaces were built into chants, and navigational songsoral atlases passed from master to apprentice like sacred scripts. These weren't accidental drifts. They were targeted migrations, purposeful, calculated. Sophisticated enough that modern navigators using the same techniques have successfully retraced their journeys with eerie accuracy. Western explorers once called the Pacific a mystery. But for the Polynesians, it was home. Not a void, but a map they'd already memorized. And while they were decoding the ocean's rhythm, another culture far inland was cracking jokes crude, eternal, and suspiciously modern. The oldest recorded joke is from Sumer, circa 1900 BCE. Turns out, potty humor is eternal. The oldest surviving joke in human history, dating back to Sumer around 1900 BCE, is a toilet joke, or more specifically, a fart joke. Carved in cuneiform, preserved on clay. The joke reads, "Something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap." Ba-dum-tis. It's not exactly highbrow, but it's perfect. Because it tells us that even 4,000 years ago, human beings found the same things funny. Social taboos, bodily functions, gender roles. And also that, just like today, someone went to the trouble of writing it down and preserving it. Humor, it turns out, is one of the oldest technologies, a tool for tension, rebellion, flirtation, and truth. What we laugh at reveals what we fear, what we repress, and what we find undeniably real. That the first written joke is about flatulence isn't an accident. It's a mirror, a very gassy, slightly tragic, profoundly human mirror. And as laughter echoed across ancient taverns, the Greeks were harnessing fire not for jokes, but to destroy cities from a distance. The ancient Greeks used fire-powered siege weapons. Before flamethrowers existed, the Greeks flirted with the idea of incinerating enemies with sunlight and science. They weren't just philosophers and sculptors, they were engineers of warfare. And some of their designs sound like something out of a Bond villain's sketchbook. Among the most notorious, mirrors as weapons. According to legend and some ancient sources, Archimedes, the math-obsessed genius of Syracuse, allegedly devised a way to set Roman ships on fire using polished bronze mirrors to concentrate sunlight into a beam of destruction. Sunlight as artillery. Modern tests have debated whether this would have worked. But whether it was real, exaggerated, or purely theoretical, the point stands. The Greeks were dreaming of using optics, geometry, and combustion to alter the battlefield. Beyond that, they developed torsion-powered catapults, incendiary arrows, and even chemical compounds meant to produce smoke or flame. This was war not as brute force, but as applied science. It wasn't just about killing enemies, it was about doing it with flair, precision, and a terrifying sense of spectacle. And while Greek engineers flirted with flame and parabolas, another civilization was carving out words on stone long before the Maya took the stage. The Zapotecs created a written language before the Maya. Long before the Maya carved their glyphs into limestone temples, the Zapotecs were already pressing symbols into stone building, a written tradition in the heart of Oaxaca. The Zapotecs flourished in Monte Alban, a city perched on a mountaintop like an eagle's nest. Here, amid the stepped pyramids and ceremonial platforms, they etched a script that remains partially undeciphered to this day. Their glyphs weren't just decorative. They recorded wars, dynasties, religious rituals, and possibly even legal codes. This wasn't a minor footnote in history. It was a full-fledged writing system, dating back to at least 500 BC epidating, or running parallel to Olmec and early Maya scripts. Which means literacy in Mesoamerica didn't start in the Yucatan. It started here, on high ground. Their writing survives mostly in stone monuments called danzantes, once thought to depict dancing figures, but now believed to show defeated captives, each labeled with names, places, or fates. In other words, history, punishment, and power etched forever. Yet we forget the Zapotecs, overshadowed by more dramatic ruins, more deciphered texts. And while they wrote with stone, another ancient soul left their footprint in leather so old, it makes the pyramids look new. A 5,000-year-old shoe was found in Armenia. In a cave in Armenia, tucked beneath layers of sheep dung and silence, archaeologists found something absurdly relatable: a shoe. A single, leather, size 7-ish moccasin, stuffed with grass and laced up the side. And it's older than the pyramids. Carbon dated to around 3,500 BCE, this shoe wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't royal, it was just practical, durable, designed to protect a human foot in a harsh world. Someone wore this through mountain trails, probably stepped in things, and eventually left it behind in a moment of forgetfulness or intentional burial. And time, for once, decided to preserve. The craftsmanship is astonishing. One piece of leather, tanned and shaped to the contours of the human foot, grass stuffed inside as insulation. Functional design, born not from factories but from necessity and observation. And this isn't just a shoe. It's a footprint in history, a literal imprint of a single life, preserved by chance. Not a king, not a god, just someone who walked and left something behind. Meanwhile, as that person trudged through prehistoric Armenia, a priestess, half a world away, was inhaling sacred gas and speaking riddles from the bowels of the earth. The Oracle of Delphi, Saturday over a gas-emitting fault line. In the cliffs of Mount Parnassus, beneath the Temple of Apollo, the Oracle of Delphi sat on a tripod, muttering riddles and visions that shaped the fate of kings and empires. Her name was the Pythia, and for centuries, her prophecies were treated as divine, wisdom cryptic, dramatic, often maddeningly ambiguous. But here's the twist. She wasn't just channeling the gods. She was probably high. Modern geological studies of the area revealed that the temple was built directly over a fault line that emits ethylene gas, a mildly intoxicating substance that, in high enough concentrations, causes trance-like states, hallucinations, and euphoria. The Pythia, seated above this sacred fissure, inhaled the earth's invisible breath and entered altered states that were interpreted as divine communion. Ancient descriptions noted her frenzied behavior, her strange voice, and the physical transformation she underwent while delivering her oracles. These weren't performances. They were physiological reactions, part spiritual, part chemical, and entirely real. The ancients didn't know the periodic table, but they understood atmosphere. They built a religion on a leak in the earth. And while Greek elites sought fate in fumes, Norse warriors were applying something a little more cosmetic before heading into battle eyeliner. Viking warriors wore eyeliner. Picture a Viking, axe in hand, beard bristling, screaming across a battlefield and wearing expertly applied eyeliner. Not war paint, not face tattoos, eyeliner. Coal-based, dark, deliberate. This wasn't just for style. Vikings believed that lining the eyes helped protect them from the glare of the sun and the sting of wind on the open sea. But beyond that, it gave them a distinct, almost supernatural presence. Intimidation mattered in warfare. Looking like a ghost or a god could tip the psychological scale before the first blow landed. Both men and women used coal, likely acquired through trade routes stretching into the Middle East. The Norse were not the isolated brutes. They're often portrayed as they were travelers, traders, and cultural magpies. If something worked, they adopted it. If it looked good, even better. To enemies who had never seen a man with lined eyes wielding a bloodied axe, the effect must have been unsettling. The gaze of death, framed by smoky shadow. So the next time you see a Viking depicted as a mud-smeared savage, remember, he might have spent more time on his eyeliner than you did this morning. And while Norsemen painted their rage, the Phoenicians were squeezing snails for the world's most expensive color. The Phoenicians discovered color-fast purple dye. If you wanted to show off your wealth in the ancient world, you didn't need a gold crown or a marble villa. You needed purple. Not just any purple, Tyrian purple. The shade that stained emperors and bled into the symbols of royalty for millennia, and it came from sea snails. Lots of them. The Phoenicians discovered that crushing thousands of murex snails produced a secretion that, once exposed to light and air, turned into a vibrant, rich purple dye. It didn't fade in sunlight or wash out with wear. It got deeper, bolder, almost immortal. But the cost was grotesque. Estimates suggest it took 10,000 snails to produce just 1 gram of dye. Entire coastal cities stank from the vats of fermenting mollusks. The color became so rare and expensive that only royalty could afford it, sometimes by decree. Born in the purple wasn't just a metaphor, it was a tax bracket. This wasn't just fashion, it was hierarchy woven into fabric, status you could see from a distance. And while purple signified elite presence, Babylonian astronomers were busy calculating something even more elusive: motion, curves, and the mathematics of the heavens. Babylonian texts show basic, calculus-like thinking. Centuries before Newton ever got conked on the head by a mythical apple, the Babylonians were already sketching out the backbone of what we now call calculusan clay tablets. Using their base 60 number system, they charted planetary motions with astonishing precision. Not only did they understand linear progression, but they tracked changes over time rates, acceleration, and what today would resemble integral thinking. They weren't just watching the sky, they were modeling it. One tablet in particular describes Jupiter's position using trapezoidal areas under curvace, a concept eerily similar to modern integral calculus. And this wasn't just math for fun. These calculations informed their astrology, their calendar, and their religious festivals. To them, math wasn't abstract, it was cosmic communication. What's mind-blowing is not that they got close to calculus, but that they did it without algebra as we know it. No symbols, no Greek letters, just meticulous geometry and an obsession with pattern. It's a humbling reminder. Human intellect doesn't always wear a lab coat. Sometimes it wears a loincloth and scratches the future into mud. And while Babylon tracked stars, Egyptian surgeons were cutting through flesh with tools that still look eerily familiar. Ancient Egyptians had surgical tools resembling modern scalpels. In the realm of pyramids and scarabs, ancient Egyptian medicine might sound like a blend of magic and leeches, but step into a royal tomb or a physician's kit, and you'll find something shockingly precise: scalpels. Real ones. Crafted from bronze and sharpened to a surgical edge, these blades were stored alongside forceps, hooks, saws, and suturing needles. Some were so well made, they wouldn't look out of place in a modern operating room, albeit with more rust and fewer sterilizers. These weren't ceremonial props. They were tools used for real procedures, draining abscesses, removing tumors, stitching wounds. Egyptian physicians understood anatomy remarkably well, thanks in part to their extensive practice with mummification. Dead bodies were not sacred, they were educational. And yes, some procedures had magical spells involved, but so does modern medicine, if you count marketing slogans and bedside manner. The surgical instruments were often carried in organized kits, wooden boxes lined with designated slots, like a divine first aid tackle box. When we imagine ancient medicine, we picture bloodletting and guesswork. But Egypt reminds us, even in the shadow of gods, there were hands that healed with bronze and reason. And while Egypt cut with precision, the Minoans leapt with madness over bulls. The Minoans had sports arenas for bull leaping. Before the Romans had colosseums and the Greeks had Olympics, the Minoans had something far wilder: bull leaping. In the grand courtyards of Crestosiphicae, at Nasa, spectators gathered not for chariot races, but for a sport that makes modern rodeos look like tea parties. A young athlete would sprint toward a charging bull, grab its horns, and flip over its back in a death-defying arc. Land on your feet, and you were a hero. Miss your grip, and you were a smear. The act wasn't about domination. It was ritualistic, almost reverent. The bull wasn't an enemy, it was a sacred obstacle, part performance, part prayer, part suicide mission. Frescoes vividly depict the act. Lithe figures suspended mid-air, bulls mid-charge, the crowd mid-gasp. Men and women both participated, suggesting the Minoans saw athleticism and the divine encounter with danger as a universal human expression. Some scholars believe it was linked to fertility rites or myths about taming chaos. Others think it was simply the most dangerous halftime show in history. Either way, it was physical poetry carved into motion. And while they flew through air, Another ancient culture found a way to keep cool without so much as a single watt. Ancient Iranians used wind towers for air conditioning. Before electricity hummed through cities and air conditioning units dripped their way into modern life, the ancient Iranians were already mastering the art of indoor climate control with nothing but mud, brick, and wind. Enter the Badgir, or wind tower, tall, rectangular structures perched atop buildings in the desert cities of Persia. They weren't decorative, they were thermodynamic. Designed to capture even the faintest breeze, these towers funneled cool air down into homes and courtyards, while simultaneously pushing hot air out. Passive cooling, engineered centuries before anyone had heard of refrigerant gas. Some Badgirs were even connected to underground water channel skanats, which chilled the incoming air further as it passed over the moist earth. The result? A natural form of air conditioning that worked day and night in sweltering heat, without burning a single log or lump of coal. This wasn't a fringe luxury. It was widespread. Homes, palaces, bathhouses, they all breathed through these towers. It speaks to a culture that didn't just endure harsh environments, but turned them into engineering challenges. So, while modern cities roast under heat waves and power outages, remember, ancient Iranians were already living in wind-cooled sanctuaries. And as their towers whispered with breeze, the Romans were inventing something far less graceful but equally delicious: fast food. The Romans had fast food restaurants. Yes, ancient Rome had fast food, and no, it didn't come with a happy meal. Meet the Thermopolium, the ancient world's answer to, "I don't feel like cooking." These street-side eateries were fixtures in crowded Roman cities, where working-class citizens, especially those without kitchens in their cramped insulae apartments, grabbed hot meals on the go. A typical Thermopolium featured a stone counter lined with embedded clay jars, dolia, that held stews, wine, lentils, meat, and whatever else could be kept warm and dished out quickly. Think buffet, but with amphore. They weren't just places to eat, they were social hubs. People gossiped, schemed, flirted, and sometimes even conspired between bites of boiled goat and honeyed wine. Graffiti on the walls advertised prices or insulted competitors. One Pompeii Thermopolium even had a mural of a sneaky dog stealing sausage, a timeless warning. These joints fed Rome's underbelly, and unlike the elite who dined in private villas with reclining couches, patrons here stood shoulder to shoulder, slurping soup and arguing politics. It was loud, greasy democracy in action, and while Romans rushed through meals in clay bowls, across the ocean, ancient potters were shaping clay for something far older and far more permanent. Japanese Jomon pottery is the oldest known fired clay pottery. Long before the wheel turned and empires rose, before agriculture tamed the wild, the Jomon people of Japan were molding earth and fire into permanence. Their legacy? The oldest known fired pottery in human history. Dating back to around 14,500 BCE, Jomon pottery predates settled farming communities and turns the idea of primitive on its head. These weren't crude utilitarian bowls either. Some were elaborately decorated, with cord-marked patterns, from which the name Jomon comes, and flame, like flares curling skyward like ancient sculptures. Who needs farming when you have art? These vessels were likely used for cooking fish, storing food, or even ceremonial purposes. They reveal a society that was semi-nomadic yet sophisticated people who hunted, gathered, and fished, but still found time to perfect aesthetics and preservation. What makes this staggering isn't just the age, it's the implication. Pottery requires not just clay, but fire control, temperature regulation, and structural foresight. That means this wasn't a fluke. It was an innovation passed down over generations. So while the so-called cradles of civilization were still napping, Jomon potters were already firing up the kiln-etching permanence into clay while the rest of humanity played with sticks. Ancient Sudan had more pyramids than Egypt. If pyramids are the measure of a civilization's grandeur, then Egypt has long reigned supreme in the public imagination. But here's the kicker. It's not the pyramid capital of the ancient world. That title belongs to Sudan. In the desert sands of Nubia, the kingdom of Kush built over 200 pyramids, twice as many as Egypt. These sharp-angled structures rise from the ground like dagger points, clustered across sites like Meroe and Nuri. Smaller and steeper than their Egyptian cousins, they're no less majestic, and no less mysterious. The Nubian pyramids were royal tombs, constructed for kings, queens, and nobles who ruled over a land rich in gold, culture, and military prowess. The Kushites weren't Egypt's understudies, they were its rivals. At one point, they even ruled over Egypt as its 25th dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs. The pyramids in Sudan aren't just architectural echoes. They're statements of power, legacy, and defiance. Yet most people don't even know they exist. While Egypt polished its monuments into tourism gold, Sudan's pyramids remained buried in obscurity and sand, but they stand nonetheless testaments to a kingdom that refused to be forgotten. And as the Kushites built skyward, the Chinese were quietly revolutionizing comfort, one sheet at a time. The Chinese invented toilet paper in the 6th century. It's easy to take for granted, that soft, folded, indispensable roll in every bathroom, but there was a time when leaves, sticks, and sand got the job done. Until, of course, the Chinese changed the game again. In the 6th century CE, records show that the Chinese elite began using paper not just for books, but for the backside. The first mention of toilet paper comes from an official court document, casually noting that paper for wiping must not contain the names of the sages or classics. You know, don't defile Confucius with your defecation. This wasn't the flimsy, mass-produced stuff we know today. Early toilet paper was thick, soft, and large-crafted specifically for imperial hygiene. By the 14th century, it was being manufactured by the thousands of sheets for the emperor's use alone. The rest of the world? Still scraping with whatever nature provided. It would take centuries for the concept to flush its way west. So the next time you're sitting comfortably with your modern roll, thank the Tang dynasty for dignifying the most undignified part of daily life. Meanwhile, in a culture not far removed in space but worlds apart in belief, sacred insight came not from paper but from a liver. The Etruscans believed in divination through animal livers. Forget horoscopes. The Etruscans read the future in liver. In their spiritual system, the liver wasn't just an organ, it was the cosmic command center of the body. By examining the shape, color, texture, and blemishes of a freshly slaughtered animal's liver, usually a sheep's, they believed priests could divine the will of the gods, interpret omens, and make decisions that impacted everything from harvests to war. To aid in this bizarre sacred science, Etruscan priests used bronze models of livers inscribed with zones representing different gods. These weren't toys. They were theological maps guides for trained haruspices to analyze divine messages encoded in meat. What reads today like a morbid novelty was taken dead seriously. The Romans inherited the practice and institutionalized it. Even emperors consulted liver readers before major decisions. Imagine making state policy based on whether a goat's liver looked moody. What makes it more than just ancient weirdness is the system behind it. It was detailed, structured, repeatable. They weren't stabbing in the dark. They were following a logic, just one written in entrails instead of equations. And as they read fate in flesh, other Greeks were dropping their tunics altogether for a very different ritual. Greek athletes competed nude. In the ancient Greek world, nothing said peak performance like full frontal nudity. From the Olympic Games to local gymnasium contests, male athletes stripped down completely, an act not of scandal, but of idealism. Competing nude was a celebration of the human form, a philosophical and aesthetic statement as much as an athletic one. The Greek word gymnos literally means naked, which gives you some context on what they thought the proper attire for fitness was, None. Why? Because the Greeks believed the body was divine. Muscles weren't just functional, they were moral. Strength, symmetry, and grace represented order, discipline, and beauty. Competing in the nude removed class distinctions, no luxury gear, limited cheating, harder to hide weapons, and made the athletes living sculptures of already excellence. It wasn't all glory, though. Body oil was mandatory, dust was poured over sweat for grip, and the occasional accidental injury was part of the deal. There were even attendants whose job was to scrape the athlete's oily, dusty skin with a strigil afterward, a kind of post-match exfoliation ritual. So the next time your gym buddy complains about the dress code, remind them, ancient Greece had none, and while they were shedding clothing, the Egyptians were dispensing something holier through a vending machine. The first vending machine dispensed holy water. Long before soft drinks and snack bags fell with a clunk, there stood in ancient Alexandria a vending machine, yes, a vending machine created not for convenience, but for reverence. Hero of Alexandria, a first-century Greek engineer and inventor, designed a device that accepted coins and dispensed holy water at temples. Drop a coin into the machine, and it would fall onto a lever that opened a valve. Out came the sacred liquid. Once the coin slid off, the valve shut. It was mechanical. It was repeatable. It was ingenious. This wasn't a novelty. It was a solution to a problem. Temple-goers often took more than their fair share of blessed water. Hero's device regulated access and early exercise in fairness and automation. And, possibly, an early example of divine capitalism. Hero didn't stop there. He created steam-powered devices, puppet shows, and even a prototype for a steam turbine. But the vending machine remains his most bizarrely modern legacy. The fact that the first automated dispenser wasn't for food or fun, but for worship, says everything about what ancient people valued and how quickly they were willing to mechanize it. And while Hero's machine dropped coins for divinity, a far older artifact etched something deeper, the very land itself. The oldest known map is etched on stone from Spain. Long before cartographers inked coastlines onto parchment, someone in Ice Age Spain decided to carve their landscape into stone, not symbols, not myths. But a topographic map etched around 14,000 BCE. This stone slab, covered with carefully incised lines, is believed to depict rivers, hills, and perhaps hunting grounds in the surrounding region. It wasn't abstract, it wasn't spiritual. It was practical navigation, territory marking, survival tool, a prehistoric Google Earth minus the zoom function. What makes this so astonishing is that it predates not only writing, but agriculture. These were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, carving spatial intelligence into rock tens of thousands of years before the wheel. It suggests a complex understanding of geography, memory, and the need to transmit that information visually. Mapping isn't just about exploration, it's about cognition. To draw a landscape is to mentally step outside of it, to see from above what you walk through below. That's a huge leap in consciousness. So, this ancient map isn't just the oldest, it's possibly the first expression of abstract space, and it forces us to ask, what else did they know that we're only now rediscovering? Just as they carved rivers into stone, the Romans were scribbling something far darker into their own artifacts curses. Romans had curse tablets. You've probably heard of love letters, tax records, and war decrees written on Roman tablets. But curse tablets? Those were the ancient equivalent of sending a hit request to the gods written in lead and dropped into the underworld's suggestion box. These small sheets of soft metal, usually lead or pewter, were inscribed with malicious wishes, hexes, vengeance pleas, or supernatural subpoenas. Often folded or pierced with nails, they were then deposited in wells, tombs, or sacred springs places considered liminal, where spirits could read your hate mail and get to work. The targets? Cheating lovers, business rivals, athletes, and chariot racers. The language was brutal and often poetic. May his tongue be twisted. Blind him until he repents. Or, strike her down with fever until she admits her crime. Some included the names of underworld deities, like Hecate or Pluto, invoked like demonic contractors. These weren't the whims of unhinged individuals. They were widespread, systematic, and often written by hired professionals, ancient hitmen with styluses. Cursing wasn't outlaw religion, it was grassroots justice. And while Rome scribbled vengeance into metal, a far older alphabet was taking shape in the hands of Syrian scribe San alphabet that would outlive empires. Ancient Syrians created the first alphabet. Before the alphabet, there were pictograms, ideograms, and syllabary systems that required thousands of symbols to express even basic ideas. Then came the scribes of Ugarit, a Bronze Age port city in what is now Syria, who changed everything by simplifying language down to its bones. The Ugaritic script, dating to around 1400 BCE, was a cuneiform alphabet 30 symbols carved into clay tablets, each representing a specific sound. It was compact, learnable, and powerful. For the first time, ordinary people, not just a priestly elite, had a chance to learn to write. This was the dawn of phonetic literacy, and it spread like wildfire. The Ugaritic system is considered a precursor to the Phoenician alphabet, which in turn birthed Greek, Latin, and eventually the entire family tree of modern Western scripts. It's not just a historical footnote, the linguistic Big Bang. What's extraordinary is how little attention this gets. We worship the Greeks for their letters, but those letters had ancestors in the Levant. The DNA of your keyboard traces back to these ancient innovators, whose legacy lives in every vowel you've ever typed. And while their script moved the world forward, the Mayans believed certain places didn't lead to progress but to the dead. The Mayans believed cenotes were gateways to the underworld. To the Maya, cenotes weren't just sinkholes, they were sacred mouths to the afterlife. Crystal clear and eerily silent, these limestone wells dotted the Yucatan Peninsula like portals into another dimension. And the Maya treated them accordingly. In their cosmology, the underworld Xibalba wasn't a place of fire and brimstone, but of trials, gods, and dark, watery realms. Cenotes were access points, places where the mortal and divine collided, so they made offerings, pottery, jade, obsidian, food, and human lives. Archaeological dives into sacred cenotes have recovered bones, skulls, and sacrificial items lying untouched for centuries. These weren't crime scenes, they were divine negotiations. A prayer carved in flesh, hurled into the still water in hopes of rain, prosperity, or appeasement. It wasn't mindless violence. It was ritual necessity. The gods of Xibalba needed acknowledgement, and the cenotes were their inbox. And yet, for all their darkness, cenotes also symbolized life. They provided fresh water, sustained crops, and anchored cities. They were death and rebirth in a single, silent circle. While the Maya gazed into water for mystery, the ancient Ainu people looked toward their legends, myths of giants and forgotten roots. The Ainu of Japan had a distinct language and appearance. In the mists of northern Japan, hidden behind centuries of assimilation and silence, lived the Ainuan indigenous people with their own language, spiritual system, and mythology, utterly distinct from the Japanese mainstream. To outsiders, they were enigmatic. To themselves, they were simply human. Their appearance set them apart, often taller, with lighter skin and fuller facial hair than their neighbors. Their language? A linguistic isolate, bearing no known relation to Japanese or any other Asian language. Oral traditions carried their myths, giants who roamed the mountains, animal gods who gifted fire, and spirits who lingered in every river and tree. The Ainu worldview was animist. Everything had a spirit, kamui, from bears to kitchen utensils. Rituals were performed not out of fear, but of mutual respect. To kill a bear was not an act of dominance, but of exchange, and the bear's spirit was sent off with songs and ceremonial wine. But over time, their identity was systematically erased, assimilated, marginalized, their language all but extinguished. Only in recent decades have efforts begun to revive what was nearly lost. And while the Ainu wore their traditions like armor, Egyptians took that idea literally, wearing perfume on their heads. Egyptians wore perfume cones on their heads. Ancient Egyptian fashion didn't stop at kohl eyeliner or linen robes. It extended skyward into the surreal world of perfume cones. These mysterious waxy domes, perched atop the heads of elites in countless tomb paintings, were long misunderstood. Art historians once thought them symbolic, until archaeologists found actual residue on mummies. They were real. They melted. And they smelled divine. Made from scented beeswax or animal fat, the cones contained oils infused with myrrh, frankincense, or lotus blossom. As the cone melted in the desert heat, it released fragrance over hours, bathing the wearer in a slow, aromatic diffusion of status and sanctity. They weren't just fashion statements, they were sensory experiences. A mobile incense burner fused to the skull, perfect for banquets, temple ceremonies, and afterlife preparation. Imagine arriving at a party wearing a literal cone of perfume, your social aroma slowly unveiling with every passing hour. It was part hygiene, part luxury, part spiritual cleanliness, because to smell divine was, in a sense, to be divine. And as Egyptians let fragrance drip into their wigs, Assyrian kings stared into the darkness of dreams, searching for something far less pleasant. Assyrian kings documented dreams. In the austere, brutal palaces of ancient Assyria, where kings carved their triumphs in blood and stone, there was another, quieter archive being kept. Not war records, not tribute lists, dreams. The Assyrians believed that dreams were messages from the gods or warnings from demons. Kings and priests didn't just remember them, they documented them, interpreted them, and sometimes even acted upon them. Entire clay tablets were devoted to dreams, what they meant, how to decode them, and what rituals should be performed in response. A king dreaming of a lion might see it as a sign of victory or divine punishment. A flooded river could mean fertility or war. It all depended on the interpreter and on which god was speaking from the other side of sleep. They even had professional dream readers, oracles who specialized in the grammar of the subconscious. Some dreams were too dangerous to ignore. Others required offerings or sacrifices to neutralize their power. In a culture obsessed with omens, dreams weren't personal. They were public intelligence, psychic reconnaissance missions conducted nightly. And while kings were decoding sleep, ancient Siberians were turning their flesh into mapsetch, not with ink, but meaning. Ancient Arctic Siberians tattooed themselves for spiritual power. In the frozen silence of Siberia, where survival was an act of daily defiance, ancient peoples etched power into their own flesh. The Pazyryk culture, nestled in the Altai Mountains more than 2,500 years ago, left behind mummified bodies so well preserved by permafrost that their tattoos are still visible: coiling animals, swirling lines, mythic creatures rendered in delicate black ink across shoulders, backs, and arms. These weren't decorations, they were talismans, portals, identity carved into skin. The designs weren't random either. Each symbol likely held specific spiritual significance: protection from spirits, connection to ancestors, symbols of clan or totemic power. In a land where the dead froze instead of decaying, the tattoos outlasted even the bones. Some scholars believe these tattoos also marked social roles: shamans, warriors, nobility. But regardless of status, what's clear is that they weren't superficial. They were cosmologies written in flesh. A body wasn't just a body. It was a scroll. And while the Siberians tattooed their meanings, the Greeks were struggling to make sense of the body itself, starting with the brain. The Greeks thought the brain cooled the blood. In a culture that could calculate planetary motion and invent democracy, it's almost comforting to know the ancient Greeks got some things hilariously wrong, like the brain. To them, the brain wasn't the seat of thought, feeling, or consciousness. It was a radiator, a cooling system for the blood. Aristotle lies. That Aristotle leered that the heart was the true center of emotion and reason. The brain, in contrast, was there to regulate temperature, a passive organ that kept the blood from boiling over. Emotions, decisions, dreams, all cooked in the chest. The head, just an ice pack. The irony, of course, is that they were so close. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen performed rudimentary brain surgeries. They noticed damage to the head could alter behavior. And yet, the heart kept its throne in their philosophical anatomy. It would take centuries before this was overturned. Until then, love resided in the chest, wisdom in the ribs, and the skull was just there for decoration. And while Greek thinkers were cooling their thoughts, a Babylonian merchant had already perfected a hotter emotion raj pressed into clay. A Babylonian tablet contains a customer complaint. History's first Yelp review wasn't typed. It was etched into clay, baked in fire, and delivered with the fury of a very unhappy man. Sometime around 1750 BCE, a Babylonian customer named Nani sent a letter to a copper merchant named Ea Nasir. The tone? Less, "Dear sir," and more, "How dare you?" Nani accused Ea Nasir of delivering substandard copper ingots, insulting his messenger, and running a generally incompetent business, and he wasn't having it. "I will not accept copper that is not good," the tablet reads, in Akkadian cuneiform. "You treated me with contempt." It's the ancient equivalent of a one-star review, and it survived nearly 4,000 years. This wasn't a royal decree or religious text. It was an angry consumer standing up for quality control, proof that dissatisfaction, as much as worship or war, motivated people to write. The fact that this petty grievance outlived empires is both hilarious and profound. Human frustration so specific, so mundane it turned into immortality. And while merchants were being chewed out in Babylon, Roman engineers were laying roads so stubbornly durable that some are still trafficked today. Literally. Roman roads were so well built, some are still used today. The cliché says, all roads lead to Rome, but, more impressively, many of those roads still lead somewhere because they're still functioning, not symbolically, literally. Roman engineers didn't just build roads. They crafted enduring arteries of empire. Layered with stone, gravel, sand, and lime mortar, these roads were engineered with obsessive attention to drainage, gradient, and durability. The result? Roads that could withstand carts, armies, century-sand modern tires. Take the Via Appia, constructed in 312 BCE. Parts of it remain intact today, with modern vehicles occasionally rolling over stones first pressed down by legionary boots. In Britain, Roman roads still form the backbone of key routes. In the Middle East, travelers still follow paths laid out by men in togas. These weren't just transportation tools, they were psychological warfare. Roads meant control, the ability to send troops, goods, or taxes across thousands of miles. Fast, predictable, unstoppable. To walk on a Roman road was to walk on empire. And while Romans paved the world in stone, the Dacians were busy forging blades that could twist fate and pierce right through it. The Dacians used curved swords designed to bypass shields. The Romans feared them, not for their numbers, but for their blades. The Dacians, who lived in what is now Romania, wielded a weapon called the falxa curved sword or scythe-like blade, designed to reach around enemy shields and hook into exposed flesh. It didn't just kill, it disabled. Arms, tendons, faces, whatever wasn't protected was a target. The blade's curve made it impossible to defend against with conventional tactics. Roman soldiers learned this the hard way during the Dacian Wars. Shields splintered, helmets cracked, and formations fell apart. Eventually, the Romans were forced to redesign their armor, adding protective bars across helmets and reinforcing arm guards just to survive these slashing arcs of iron. The Phalanx wasn't just clever engineering, it was a tactical philosophy. Why break through a defense when you can reach around it? The Dacians were not an empire. They didn't need one. Their blade was their banner. Their reputation so enduring that even the might of Rome bent to accommodate it. And while warriors clashed with steel in Europe, the Celts were staring into the stars, building stone observatories before Stonehenge ever cast a shadow. The Celts built large stone astronomical observatories. Long before telescopes scanned nebulae, the ancient Celts were building instruments of stone, grand, sacred circles not just for worship, but for watching the sky. Sites like Callanish in Scotland and Carrowkeel in Ireland predate or rival Stonehenge, arranged with uncanny astronomical precision. These were not random megalithic clusters. They tracked solstices, equinoxes, moon phases, and stellar alignments. To the Celts, time wasn't measured in hours. It pulsed in seasons, shadows, and starlight. Huge stones were placed in alignment with sunrise on the summer solstice or moonrise during lunar events. Observatories doubled as ceremonial centers, where druidic rituals fused cosmology with spirituality. To gather in these places was to stand in sync with the universe. The notion that the Celts were primitive, illiterate barbarians is academic slander. They were scientists cloaked in myth, engineers of the intangible. The stars weren't distant, they were guides, gods, and calendars etched in the sky. And while they read the heavens, far to the south, an ancient people whispered legends of giants' footsteps so big, even time tried to erase them. The Hmong people of Southeast Asia have oral legends of giants. Nestled in the highlands of Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and southern China, the Hmong people have passed down stories that defy archaeology but refuse to disappear. Tales of giants. Not metaphorical giants, literal ones. Towering beings who shaped the land, left behind oversized footprints, and moved stones no human hand could manage. According to Hmong oral tradition, these giants lived before humans, or perhaps alongside them, building immense structures and carving out rivers with their strides. When they vanished, they left behind silence and wonder. These stories aren't written down. They're sung, spoken, repeated from elder to child in a rhythm older than ink, which means they don't evolve like texts, they echo like chants. And while modern historians may scoff, there's something unnerving about how similar these myths are to those found in unrelated cultures. Giants, floods, sudden disappearances. Were they symbolic? Allegories for ancestral greatness? Maybe. Or maybe they're fossilized memories of early hominids or ancient civilizations long lost to erosion and war. Either way, when a people with no written language tells you the mountains once walked, it's worth listening. And while their giants roamed the earth, other ancient architects reached for the sky using nothing but mud. The ancient South Arabians built skyscrapers of mud brick. In the scorching expanse of Yemen's desert, where water is scarce and modernity often avoids, rises a skyline so improbable it feels like myth. Shibam, the Manhattan of the desert. But it's not glass and steel, it's mud. The ancient South Arabians, centuries ago, built vertical cities using nothing but sun-dried mud brick. Towering over 11 stories high, these structures have stood for hundreds of years, surviving storms, heat waves, and time itself. No cranes, no rebar, just dirt, water, straw, and staggering ingenuity. The logic was elegant. With limited space and the threat of flash floods, they built upward. Each building is narrow, shaded, and structurally reinforced through centuries of trial and communal maintenance. Entire communities live in these vertical homes, climbing wooden stairs, sharing walls, and peering out over the same desert their ancestors once watched for raiders. Shibam wasn't an anomaly. Similar towers rose across ancient South Arabia, monuments to resourcefulness rather than decadence. They didn't build to impress gods, they built to survive. And while they stacked their cities skyward, in Alexandria, another genius was busy bottling the future in steam and smoke. The Greeks used steam power for toys and doors. Centuries before the Industrial Revolution, the Greeks had steam engines. They just used them to impress guests. Hero of Alexandria, the same mind behind the world's first vending machine, also invented the Aeolipolia steam-powered sphere that spun on its axis when heated. A basic turbine, centuries before turbines existed. It did nothing useful. It was a toy. But it was the beginning of something massive, harnessing pressure to produce motion. Hero also used steam to automate doors in temples. When a priest lit a fire on the altar, the heat caused pressure to build, water to shift, and volagent bronze doors would swing open as if by divine will. Faith powered by physics, worship enhanced by wonder. The tragedy? No one scaled it up. The Greeks saw steam as spectacle, not industry. Hero's work became curiosities, not blueprints. 1,000 years later, Europe would rediscover steam, this time for engines, warships, and empire. Hero was standing on the edge of modernity, toying with its power, and then the world blinked. But farther south, on desert plains carved by wind and spirit, another civilization was sketching mysteries so vast, you had to be in the sky to see them. The Nazca lines might have been ritual walking paths. Stretching across the arid Peruvian desert, the Nazca lines are so massive they can only be fully appreciated from the air-geometric patterns, animals, and humanoid figures etched into the earth like invitations to the gods. For decades, they've been the subject of wild speculation. Ancient aliens, landing strips, astronomical calendars. But another theory lingers quietly, and it might be the most hauntingly human of all. What if they were meant to be walked? Some archaeologists suggest the lines weren't meant for the sky, but for the feet, for ritual processions, spiritual pilgrimages traced slowly across geometric paths. The shapes weren't messages to deities above, they were journeys for those below. Participants may have walked in silence, or chanted, or wept, their footsteps weaving meaning into dust. This transforms the Nazca lines from distant spectacle to intimate choreography. Less alien landing strip, more sacred labyrinth, less visual, more visceral. And in a land without rain, without harvest security, the lines may have been a desperate attempt to summon order paths walked into the ground as offerings, prayers made with souls instead of voices. And while the Nazca etched shapes into the earth, deeper in the Amazon, something older, something forgotten was already buried. A lost civilization in the Amazon-built massive earthworks. For centuries, the Amazon rainforest was dismissed as a biological wonder, but a cultural void. The thinking was, too dense, too humid, too wild for complex societies. But then, deforestation began. And with the trees went the illusion. Beneath the jungle's lush green veil, archaeologists began spotting patterns: geometric trenches, raised causeways, circular enclosures, too symmetrical to be natural, too deliberate to be accidents. These weren't random clearings. They were the scars of a vanished civilization. Hundreds of geoglyphs carved into the earth by hands that predated modern tribes by centuries, maybe millennia. They weren't Maya. They weren't Inca. They were something else. We don't know their name. We don't know why they vanished. But what we do know is this: the Amazon was not untouched. It was engineered, sculpted, inhabited by people who managed the forest like a garden and built cities out of silence. The jungle didn't conquer them. It concealed them, preserved them, and then grew over them like a jealous god. And while their stories faded beneath vines and roots, a more terrifying silence was taking shape in the steppes of Eurasia where the Huns left no words behind, only dread. The Huns never left written records. They thundered across the steppe like a storm. Their horses were fast, their arrows precise, their presence apocalyptic. But when the dust settled, what remained? Not libraries, not chronicles, just fear. The Huns, whose very name still echoes like a warning, left no written records of their own. No stone inscriptions, no epic poems, no tablets hidden in caves. Everything we know, everything comes from the terrified whispers of their enemies. To the Romans, they were the embodiment of chaos. To the Goths, a force of nature. To history, a riddle wrapped in leather and blood. Attila, their most infamous leader, was called the Scourge of God, a nickname that says more about Roman guilt than Hunnic theology. Yet even he left behind no words, no manifestos, no declarations. Just devastation. This is the haunting power of the Huns, a people who reshaped the map of Europe without ever etching their story into it. They moved like ghosts, fought like fire, and disappeared without a trace, except for the fear. And while the Huns vanished into the silence, another script was beginning to whisper its secrets etched in stone, waiting centuries to be half understood. The Epi Olmec script predates the better-known Maya writing. When people think of ancient Mesoamerican writing, the Maya usually steal the spotlight with their ornate glyphs and calendar obsessions. But before their linguistic symphonies were carved into temples, the Epi Olmec were already pressing a different kind of language into stone. The Epi Olmec civilization, a cultural bridge between the Olmec and the Maya, developed a script that predates the Mayas by centuries. It wasn't just symbols, it was full-blown writing, complete with phonetic components and narrative structures. One of the most important artifacts, the La Mohara Stela, reads like a historical diary etched in volcanic rock, names, dates, deeds, omens. But the tragedy? It's still only partially deciphered. Unlike the Maya, who left thousands of texts and monuments, the Epi Olmec left fewer examples, and their script was overshadowed by the rise of newer powers. Their words, buried in silence, remain a puzzle without all the pieces. It's a reminder that history favors the prolific, not always the first. And while they were encoding identity in stone, ancient Thai cultures were tuning their myths and rituals into something louder, metal drums that echoed across islands and generations. Ancient Thai cultures created bronze drums used in rituals. In the misty valleys of ancient Southeast Asia, where river fog wrapped villages like myth, a different kind of power was ringing out, not through war or conquest, but through rhythm. The Dongsun drums, massive bronze instruments forged in what is now northern Vietnam and Thailand, were more than music makers. They were sacred, they were symbols, and they were loud enough to command both spirits and men. Crafted with elaborate patterns, concentric circles, stylized birds, warriors in boats, these drums were ritually struck during ceremonies for rain, fertility, harvest, and warfare. When they rang out, it wasn't just noise, it was narrative. A bronze broadcast to gods and ancestors. And they weren't local novelties. These drums spread far and wide, reaching Indonesia, southern China, and beyond. Which means their influence moved faster than empire, carried not by armies, but by myth. They weren't tools, they were declarations. We are here, we remember, we resonate. And while their sound echoed through mountains, a quieter legacy was taking shape in Brickone, built on exactitude, repetition, and a civilization that planned its cities like a divine grid. The Harappans used standardized weights and bricks. Before Rome, before Athens, before Babylon even had a city wall, the Harappans were stacking bricks with mathematical precision, not metaphorical precision, measurable, quantifiable, standardized. In the Indus Valley, around 2600 BCE, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were built with bricks of identical proportions, 1, 2 to 4. Every house, drain, and granary used them. It wasn't aesthetics, it was regulation. Urban planning before most of the world figured out how to stop pooping in the street. And the uniformity didn't stop with bricks. Harappan merchants used standardized weights and measures perfectly carved stone cubes for trade and taxation. Across cities separated by hundreds of miles, the same systems were in place. No central king, no empire, just consensus, order by design. This wasn't a fluke, it was policy without politicians, a civilization that managed to plan without megalomania. And then, mysteriously, they vanished. No mass graves, no epic battles, just a slow, eerie withdrawal into obscurity. They left behind no palaces, no grandiose monuments, just perfectly laid brick sand, the silence of a society that chose structure over spectacle. And perched in a canyon thousands of miles away, another people were doing the opposite, building into cliffs, hiding in plain sight. The ancestral Puebloans built cliff cities with multi-story homes. In the red rock cliffs of the American Southwest, where the desert sun scorches by day and the winds howl through canyons by night, the ancestral Puebloans built cities that defy time and gravity. Cliff Palace, Mesa Verde names we've given them. But centuries before Colorado existed, these people were carving out homes high in the canyon walls, stacking stone and adobe into multi-story dwellings, accessed only by precarious wooden ladders. From a distance, they look like geological anomaly pockets of architecture clinging to sheer cliffs. Up close, they are proof of genius, forged in isolation. Each complex included living quarters, storage rooms, and kiva ceremonial spaces sunk into the earth, where firelight flickered off sacred murals. These weren't temporary shelters. They were designed communities, engineered for defense, climate control, and social cohesion. The cliff cities were built in response to something. Drought? Conflict? Religion? No one agrees, but what's certain is this: they weren't hiding. They were thriving vertical villages, echoing with the chants of rituals and the rhythms of survival. And while the Puebloans lived in stone, halfway across the world, the Thracians were dying in it, bringing their horses with them. The Thracians buried warriors with their horses. When a Thracian warrior died, he didn't ride alone into the afterlife. He took his horse with him. In the burial mounds scattered across modern-day Bulgaria and parts of the Balkans, archaeologists have uncovered a haunting pattern: human remains buried alongside their steeds, not statues, not symbols. Real horses, sacrificed and interred with full honors beside the warriors they once carried. To the Thracians, the horse was more than a tool. It was a companion in war and a guide in death. Some graves even suggest the horse was adorned, armored, or ritually prepared before burial, its body carefully positioned as if standing eternal guard. It's a window into a culture that saw death not as an ending, but as a continuation of duty. These warriors weren't buried alone. They rode off together, into a dimension where loyalty outlived breath. Little of Thracian writing survives. Most of what we know comes from Greek and Roman accounts, many of which saw the Thracians as fierce, wild, and superstitious. But if their graves say anything, it's this: they believed in companionship, stronger than the grave. And while they buried with beasts, Persian kings were planting something gentler: the gardens of paradise. Ancient Persian kings grew elaborate gardens called paradises. Before paradise meant heaven, it meant a garden specifically, one designed by Persian kings. The word comes from pari-daiza, Old Persian for walled enclosure. But these weren't just botanical displays. They were microcosms of the universe, symmetrical, irrigated, bursting with flowers, fruit trees, and flowing water. In the heart of an empire defined by deserts, these gardens were controlled, curated oasis, a declaration of mastery over nature itself. Every element was intentional. The layout followed strict geometries, symbolizing order in a chaotic world. Shade trees created cool sanctuaries. Water channels mirrored the Zoroastrian concept of purity and balance. These gardens weren't for lounging, they were for contemplation, diplomacy, and spiritual reflection. To walk through a Persian paradise was to witness empire rendered in leaves and symmetry. It was a political metaphor in bloom. And the concept stuck. When Alexander conquered Persia, he took more than gold. He took garden design. The idea spread through the Islamic world, into Moorish Spain, and eventually into European Renaissance landscaping. So, next time you walk through a peaceful park, thank a Persian king for showing the world that power doesn't always need a sword, it sometimes needs a tree. And while the Persians tamed nature, far across the ocean, ancient Americans were weaving survival into their very souls. The oldest known shoes were found in Oregon. Long before Nike, Adidas, or the notion of arch support, someone in what is now Oregon looked down at the harsh earth and decided, I need something between me and that. What they created woven sagebrush bark sandalsis, the oldest known footwear ever discovered, dating back over 10,000 years. Found in Fort Rock Cave and preserved by the desert's dry embrace. These sandals weren't simple strips of hide. They were intricately braided, functional, and clearly made by someone who understood both design and discomfort. Each pair was built for durability. Tight weaves reinforced soles. Flexible straps secured them to feet that roamed a landscape still shedding its Ice Age skin. These weren't ceremonial. They were worn, used, abandoned, left behind like every other tool of survival only to outlast everything else. These shoes tell us that even at the dawn of human civilization, people weren't just thinking about food or fire. They were crafting comfort, planning for the journey, walking forward literally into history. And while Oregonians were weaving sandals, the Maya were engineering temples that did more than impress the eyes, they played tricks on the ears. Maya temples were acoustically engineered. The Maya didn't just build big, they built smart, sometimes so smart that their designs still baffle physicists today. One of the most haunting examples? Sound engineering in sacred spaces. At Chichen Itza, a person clapping their hands at the base of the Temple of Kukulkan can hear an echo that mimics the chirp of a sacred bird, the quetzal. A sound wave designed in limestone and legacy. Not an accident. An acoustic phenomenon crafted with such precision that it leaves modern architects nodding in disbelief. It wasn't just about birdsong. In some temples, whispering from one end of a corridor could be clearly heard at the other. The steps created rhythmic feedback. The ball courts amplified shouts and silences alike. These weren't tricks, they were messages. Audio alignment with cosmology, a way to bring gods into ritual through echo and vibration. The temples didn't just reach upward, they resonated outward, catching the sounds of ceremony and throwing them back as celestial approval. Maya science didn't wear a lab coat, it wore feathers and stone. And while the Maya were playing with sound, across the Red Sea, another African kingdom was minting its legacy-owned coin at a time. The Aksumite Empire minted its own coins. Sub-Saharan Africa isn't usually associated with ancient coinage, but that's not a flaw in history. It's a flaw in how history is told. The Aksumite Empire, centered in modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, minted its own coins as early as the 3rd century CE gold, silver, bronze. Inscribed with Ge'ez script, stamped with the faces of kings and Christian crosses, these coins were more than currency. They were political declarations, religious affirmations, proof of international commerce in a kingdom that many still wrongly label isolated. Aksum wasn't a backwater. It was a trade giant, dealing with Rome, Persia, India, and Arabia. Its ports were bustling, its rulers literate, and its mint impressively standardized. Each coin was measured, weighed, regulated, a full economic ecosystem. More than just tokens of wealth, These coins were vessels of ideology. When King Azana converted to Christianity, his coins reflected the shift. The state's theology was etched into metal, a message you could carry in your pocket. This was an empire that didn't just interact with the world, it engraved itself into it. And while the Axumites left their mark in metal, the Celtic Druids were doing something more radical, refusing to write at all. Celtic Druids avoided writing. In a world where every great power seemed obsessed with inscription-etching names, laws, and conquests into stone and metalthy, Celtic Druids did the opposite. They chose silence. Not because they lacked the means. The Celts were perfectly capable of writing. They traded with the literate Greeks and Romans, used inscriptions on coins, and carved symbols into sacred objects. But the Druids, the intellectual and spiritual elite of Celtic society, deliberately refused to record their sacred knowledge in writing. Why? Because they believed wisdom wasn't something you could flatten into letters. It had to be lived, remembered, recited. Writing, they feared, would erode memory, kill tradition, and strip meaning from the spoken word. So instead of books, they used trained mind-soil lineages that passed down laws, cosmologies, genealogies, and moral tales across generations. This wasn't ignorance, it was control, a way to preserve power through scarcity. We know about this refusal not from the Druids themselves naturally, but from their enemies. Roman authors like Caesar wrote about the Druidic aversion to writing with a mixture of contempt and awe. Their knowledge died with them, mostly, and that was the point. Meanwhile, far above the Andes, another civilization was tying its stories into rope literally. The Inca road system was larger than the Roman one, spanning nearly 2,500 miles of brutal terrain from coastal deserts to mountain peaks so high they steal your breath. The Inca road system was a logistical masterpiece that dwarfed even Rome's famed highways. And they did it without the wheel, without beasts of burden for transport, without metal tools for paving. The Quapacñan, or Royal Road, wasn't just a path, it was a pulse, a living artery of empire that stitched together a vast territory stretching from Colombia to Chile. Suspension bridges swayed over ravines. Switchbacks curled up cliff faces. Rest stops, known as tambos, housed runners and messengers who carried news, orders, and even food. But the roads weren't just functional, they were sacred. Some routes mirrored celestial paths. Others led to ceremonial sites where rulers communicated with gods. It was infrastructure as cosmology. To run on these roads wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Messengers known as chasquis could relay messages across hundreds of miles in a single day, passing coded ropes called quipus from hand to hand. And while the Inca ran through empires, deep beneath the sands of Persia, ancient engineers were crafting a miracles in the desert. Ancient Persians used ice houses in the desert. Picture this. It's 110 degrees in the Iranian desert, and someone hands you a scoop of ice. That's not fantasy. That's ancient Persian engineering. Enter the Yakchala, towering beehive-shaped structure used to store ice and food in blistering heat, centuries before refrigeration. These ice houses used a combination of insulation, evaporative cooling, and clever design to keep perishable goods chilled year-round. Here's how it worked. Water from nearby mountains was channeled into shallow pools during cold winter nights. It froze, was cut into blocks, and then stored deep inside the yakhchal. Thick walls made of a special clay called saruja, mixture of sand, clay, egg whites, lime, and goat, hair kept the interior cool. Wind catchers funneled airflow to maintain a lower temperature. The result? Ice. In the middle of a desert, in July. These weren't just conveniences, they were status symbols, state investments, survival tools. Entire communities depended on them to preserve food, create medicine, and even offer cold treats during the scorching months. It wasn't magic. It was physics, centuries ahead of its time. And while Persian deserts cooled in silence, across the sea, another desert people were carving rivers where none should have flowed. The Hohokam of Arizona built 500 miles of canals. In the arid expanse of what is now southern Arizona, where the ground cracks under the weight of its own dryness, the Hohokam people pulled off one of the most audacious feats of ancient engineering in North America. They built rivers out of nothing. Over 1,000 years ago, the Hohokam constructed more than 500 miles of irrigation canals by hand. Using stone tools and sheer human grit, they carved out waterways that redirected the Salt and Gila rivers into a sprawling agricultural network. These weren't ditches. They were hydrological systems, complete with distribution branches, floodgates, and maintenance routes. The scale is staggering. Their network supported tens of thousands of people and sustained crops like maize, beans, squash, and cotton in one of the harshest climates on the continent. And unlike many ancient feats, some of these canals were later reused by modern settlers, a testament to their precision. No centralized kings, no grand monuments, just water coaxed from the earth with determination and foresight. The canals were lifelines, literal veins of civilization, still visible in satellite images today. And while the Hohokam were building rivers, the Ethiopian highlands may have been hiding something far more legendary, if you believe the monks. The kingdom of Axum may have been home to the Ark of the Covenant. At the heart of Ethiopia's ancient city of Axum, in a small guarded chapel no outsider is allowed to enter, sits a boxer, so they claim. A box of unimaginable power, if the stories are true. It's called the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, that Ark, the one from the Hebrew Bible, gold-covered, God-touched, said to contain the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, it was brought to Axum by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The story goes like this. After visiting his father in Jerusalem, Menelik returned to Ethiopia with the Ark, either by divine will or royal theft, depending on the version. Ever since, the Ark has allegedly resided in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded day and night by a single monk who lives and dies in that post. He's the only person allowed to see it. No photos, no visitors, no confirmation, just faith and silence. Skeptics laugh, believers kneel, but the legend persists. Centuries old, unshaken by time or doubt. And while the Ark's presence remains a matter of divine secrecy, another mountain civilization was making its mysteries very public through plumbing. The Urartu civilization invented water pressure plumbing. High in the mountainous terrain of what is now eastern Turkey and Armenia, the Urartians were taming a different force. Water. Not just gathering it, pressurizing it. Centuries before the Romans ever dreamed of aqueducts, the Urartu kingdom was laying stone channels and sealed clay pipes that could carry water uphill. Let that sink in. Uphill. This wasn't basic irrigation. It was hydraulic engineering on a level that astonished even modern researchers. They carved canals into cliff faces, bored tunnels through solid rock, and used gravity and pressure dynamics to deliver water across impossible landscapes. Their capital, Tushpa, near modern-day Van, was outfitted with such systems, ensuring a steady supply of fresh water to a fortress perched on a mountain. These were not peasants with buckets. These were engineers with blueprints. It's one of those facts that forces a pause. How many other ancient feats have we forgotten simply because they weren't built with egos? The Urartians didn't build colosseums or pyramids, they built systems. And in those systems, a different kind of legacy flows. And speaking of systems disguised as simplicity, the Incas were tying their records into rope, maybe not just numbers, but narratives. Inca quipus might have encoded more than numbers. At first glance, a quipu looks like a tangle of colored string-snotted cords suspended from a main thread, like a macrame project halfway through. But these weren't decorations, they were data. Messages, inventories, histories, possibly even literature, if new theories are correct. The Inca used quipus to run an empire that stretched across mountains, jungles, and deserts. With no written script in the traditional sense, they encoded information in knots numbers, census data, tax records through variations in string, color, knot type, and position. They were so effective that Incan administrators could govern vast regions with them, even dispatching quipus with messengers like encrypted scrolls. But here's the real mystery. Some researchers now believe quipus might have gone beyond math. Subtle patterns suggest linguistic encoding consonants, vowels, maybe even full sentences. A potential writing system made of fiber instead of ink. A language not lost in translation, but lost in texture. If that's true, it means the Inca were speaking through thread, documenting their world in a form so alien to European sensibilities that conquistadors dismissed it as primitive. It wasn't primitive. It was unreadable by design. And while the Incas nodded their knowledge, ancient Siberians were carving something older still into mammoth ivory. Ancient Siberians made ritual carvings in woolly mammoth tusks. Long before writing, before cities, before agriculture, there was art etched into the bones of giants. In the cold silence of Ice Age Siberia, over 20,000 years ago, humans carved spirals, animals, and strange symbols into mammoth tusks. These weren't mere doodles. They were rituals fossilized in ivory. The people who made them lived hard live-shunting megafauna, surviving permafrost, but they still found time to create. The carvings often depict abstract patterns, mysterious geometries, or mythic beasts. Some seemed to mark seasonal cycles. Others, perhaps, told stories or encoded shamanic visions. Whatever their meaning, they weren't ornamental, they were ceremonial. These tusks may have been altars, offerings, or spiritual maps. That they exist at all is astonishing. Ivory decays, climate shifts, yet these objects survived, outliving empires, languages, even species. They force us to reconsider who we were before history began. Not savages, but symbol makers. Not brutes, but storytellers, who used the hardest material available to scratch a mark against time. And while Siberians engraved their dreams in tusk, far south along the Nile, someone was building the first keyon that locked the line between outsider and home. The first door locks came from ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians didn't just build pyramids, they built privacy. Some 4,000 years ago, Egyptian engineers designed the earliest known pin-and-tumbler locks, remarkably similar in concept to those on your front door. Constructed from wood, these locks used a bolt mechanism that could only be lifted by a custom-cut key, a long, notched tool that raised internal pins into alignment so the bolt could slide. It wasn't security by brute force. It was precision, a whisper of mechanical genius in a civilization often remembered more for spectacle than subtlety. These locks weren't just for tombs or temples. They were used in homes and storerooms, protecting goods, food, scrolls, anything worth keeping safe. The key itself was often large, a foot-long badge of ownership and trust, sometimes worn around the neck like a sign of status. In a world where privacy was power, the lock was more than hardware. It was a declaration. This space is mine. This threshold is guarded not by spears, but by cleverness. And with that invention, the Egyptians didn't just shut doors, they opened a new chapter in human autonomy. And so, from sandals in Oregon to locks in Thebes, ancient minds turned survival into brilliant's own mystery at a time.